Hello, and welcome to the Art Workers Guild and this event with the Guild and Roger Kneebone, who is actually a member of the Guild as well, so there you go. For those of you who haven't been before, the handful of young architects who founded the Guild 130 years ago would have loved this event. They felt their seniors were losing touch with hands-on making and needed to engage with people who actually make stuff. So they set up the Guild for just this sort of purpose, to promote the deep understanding of craftsmanship and skills. You can see our history here all around the walls, but these portraits of mustachioed old men can perhaps give the wrong impression. The founders were in their 30s, and we are especially pleased to welcome those of you who are students and the group of you who are on the Guild's mentoring scheme. There are more than 60 disciplines represented in our membership, with young makers and designers on equal terms with those who are long established, who in their turn are excited by the fresh ideas brought in by the young. This diversity of skills and approaches is what makes the Guild tick. We may, each of us, be full of awe at what someone else can do, but the understanding of what it is to make something with your hands is common to all of us. And understanding another craft deepens the understanding of one's own. These are among the themes that this day will demonstrate and explore. This event is the result of an evolution of events started 7 years ago. And ideas are little explosions along a gunpowder line of thought. So something chewed over today might well spark something to explore further. Anne Thorne, over there, Hannah, there, and I are all part of the Guild's outreach group. So do talk to us or drop us an email if today has sparked an idea for another event or collaboration or project, and perhaps we can make it happen. Who knows? So over to Roger.
Well, thank you very much, Prue, and a huge welcome to everybody. I should just say that we are, it's great to have everybody here, but it's not only the people here because we're also transmitting this on Zoom. So a big welcome to everybody who's joining us remotely. And so we'll have an opportunity, I hope, to broaden the discussions that I hope we'll be having this afternoon beyond this room to people who will be joining us online as well. But I want to start by giving a big thanks to the Art Workers Guild and to the outreach group in particular. It's a great honor to be a member of the Guild, a brother, as we're called. So particular thanks from me as well to Prue Cooper, to Hannah Coulson, and to the Art Workers Guild staff, to Elspeth Dennison, who is the Guild steward, also to Lee and Catherine, who've made this event possible. And to the many experts who appear in the book that I'm going to talk about. Some of them are here, some of them are not. And you'll recognize who some of those are because they have got labels which have been created very, very beautifully by a calligrapher who's also a member of the Art Workers Guild, Mark Largent. So you'll identify people in the book by their labels. I also want to give a particular welcome to Connor Brown from Penguin Books, who's been a huge support to me in creating this book expert, which I'm going to talk about. And also I want to say a big thanks to my own family, who are all experts in various different ways. To my daughters, Emily and Rachel, you've probably met them as you came in through the door. And you'll be seeing them as they'll be handing around microphones during the sessions that come. And most particularly to my wife, Dusha, for her support in all kinds of ways, which go far beyond what's happening today. But to all of them, thank you. So what I want to do now is just to give a bit of an introduction to what I hope we'll do today, because here we are with an extraordinarily diverse group of craftsmen and performers and scientists and artists and clinicians and all kinds of people, miscellaneous and various as well. And what I'm very much hoping is that you will all see this as an opportunity to participate, not just to sit and listen, but to talk to one another and to develop ideas, as Prue was saying, and explore and maybe come up with conversations or collaborations that are at the moment unpredictable. But who knows what comes out of conversation. So please do explore ideas and see this as an opportunity to talk to people you haven't met, find out more about them, and to get the conversation going. And for those of you particularly who are artists who think visually, I've got a whole series of blank cards here. So if you have any ideas that you would like to jot down, either in words or in illustrations or drawings, please do that and leave them here, because it would be really helpful to my colleagues and to me to get a sense of the sort of ideas that this day is triggering, really, or do email me. So what I'm going to do, what we're going to do over the course of the afternoon is I'm going to give a brief sort of synopsis, a brief introduction to the ideas in my book, Expert, talk a little bit about it. And then we're going to have a series of fairly brief provocations, which are going to take the form of conversations, brief conversations for perhaps 20 minutes or so, mostly between me and some of the other experts in the group, just two of us at a time, followed by discussion amongst the group. In the middle, we're going to have tea, 3/4 of an hour. And I want to say a big thank you not only to Dusha, but of course Prue as well, and many others for creating some of the cakes and things that you'll be having at tea time. And then we're going to come back for another couple of provocations, and then draw this part of this afternoon to a close. But I'm going to start now by just giving a bit of a sort of overview of what this day is about. So you will have gathered by now, I imagine, the people who don't know me, that my name is Roger Kneebone. I've got a background, a medical background, first as a surgeon, a general and a trauma surgeon, then as a GP for a long time, and then most recently as an academic. But I've got lots of other interests as well. I'm not practicing clinically now, but I am particularly interested in how the worlds of medicine and increasingly science play out through the lenses of craftsmanship and performance. And we're going to talk a bit more about those. I'm based at Imperial College London, but I'm very fortunate and honoured to have positions elsewhere. One is as a brother of the Art Workers Guild here. I've also got a role at the City and Guilds of London Art School. I jointly lead a centre for performance science between Imperial and the Royal College of Music. And since 2019, I've been the Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy of Arts. So this sort of covers a range of things to do with the performing and the visual arts, as well as the more sort of obviously medical things and the world of science. And last year, in August last year, I published, or Penguin Books rather, published this book called Expert, Understanding the Path to Mastery. That was in August 2020. And in August this year, the very same book came out in a new suit of clothes in paperback in just a couple of months ago. And the idea of this book is to explore what it means to become expert. And I've done that by drawing on three strands of experience. One is my own experience as a clinician, largely, but in other areas of trying things out that I'm not particularly good at, but have had a bit of experience of how difficult it can be to start off something unfamiliar. Around that are the stories of over 22, that means 22, doesn't it, really, experts, many of whom are in the room at the moment, who appear in my book. And they have contributed, they have sparked ideas, and I think helped me to sort of crystallize what are the stages that people go through when they become expert, or as they move towards becoming more and more expert. And then around that are ideas from the literature, from what other people have written, and so on. And so, so this book sets out a pathway that I'm just going to explain in a little while. So those of you who have read the book will bear with me, I hope. Those of you who haven't, I just want to give you a bit of a sense of the landscape of my argument. And then I'm going to pull out 3 or 4 elements of this pathway towards mastery, which I think are particularly interesting and important and sometimes under-recognized. And I'm going to do that in the company of the experts from the book and elsewhere that I mentioned. But the approach that I've taken is to hang my argument on the well-known progression, familiar from the medieval guilds, of going of apprentice, journeyman, master progression. Obviously using these words in a non-gendered sense these days, but I think people are familiar with that idea that you start off knowing nothing much at all, you spend a lot of time in somebody else's workshop, doing what they tell you. Eventually you get good enough to go out and journey across your country, to ply your craft or your trade. You take responsibility for the work that you're doing. And after that, after many years of doing that, you get to the stage where you are so expert that you can pass on your knowledge to other people. You have apprentices of your own. And so the world turns and comes full circle and continues. And I think that that's quite a, it's quite a useful set of hooks to hang things on, but it is a description, not an explanation, because it gives the outside story of what this pathway involves. It doesn't really tell you the inside story. And it's the inside story that I'm particularly interested in. And so when you look at these stages, what I've done in the book is to break them down into segments. So the apprenticeship stage, I've sort of framed it as a time when you are doing what other people tell you. And a lot of that stuff that you do, you don't really like. In fact, you very often really don't like it because it's repetitive and it's boring. And you think, well, why couldn't somebody else do this? Or a machine or somebody less, you know. But actually, when you look back on that, it looks very different because you find in retrospect that there are all kinds of things that have happened to you unwittingly through that process that turn out to have been invaluable. And one of those things is that you learn how to do the things that you spent all that time learning to do, because very often you need to do those things, whatever they are. And I think this cuts across, across all kinds of craftsmanship and medicine and science and everything else. But also because it teaches you other things. It teaches you how to understand and become familiar and work with the materials of your craft, whether that's textiles or stone or living human bodies, whatever it is, and the subtleties of the materials you're working with and the tools that you're working with and the space that you occupy. So that's the apprenticeship stage. And then the next one is the journeyman stage. And I think this one is particularly interesting. And we're going to come to look at that in more detail after we've had a couple of conversations with people around that early stage. The apprenticeship stage leads into a phase where you're having, I think, to make 2 crucial shifts, because as an apprentice, you tend to think, and certainly from my experience, I tend to think it was all about me and the stuff I had to learn when I was a medical student, the skills I had to gain and the knowledge and the exams I'd passed. And when I passed those exams, I was jolly pleased with myself and I wanted to show off. But I think when you go out there into the world, you have to realize, to use a phrase that I got from a couple of magicians I've been working with here, that it's not about you, it's about them. It's not about you and what you can do, it's about whoever your work is for. And to some extent, that's counterintuitive. I mean, it sounds obvious in one way, but maybe in another way, it's not so obvious. So if you're a clinician, it's not about the facts that you've learned in your exams, it's about your patients. If you're a musician, it's about your audience. If you're potter, it's about the people who see and who perhaps buy your work. Whatever it is, you're subordinating your focus on yourself to the other people for whom your work is for. But at the same time, and almost in the opposite direction, it is about you, because as you become a journeyman, you stop being a cipher in somebody else's workshop, and you become yourself. You become you as a potter or a musician or a surgeon or whatever it is, and you are unique, and you develop your own individuality, your own style, what the jazz musicians talk to as your voice. And these processes, I think, can be in tension, because you are subordinating yourself while developing yourself. And so that's something you kind of have to reach an accommodation with, I think. And then as you become more experienced, still you become a master, I think there is another shift in attentional focus. But this time it's not so much what your work is, what or who your work is for, as the people who are following in your path, in that path. And you develop a different kind of responsibility for guiding and shaping the direction that other people are taking. And I think that raises all kinds of interesting issues as well about how you do that. And it links in with issues around coaching and mentorship and supervision and all kinds of things, all kinds of different words. But the process is one of sort of nurturing and encouraging other people and supporting them as they go through these difficult stages that you yourself will have encountered. And one of those things that you will have encountered inevitably is getting things wrong and making mistakes and having to deal with it and having to deal with them and having to develop resilience and all those things, so that you don't get stopped in mid-course when you make a mistake, but equally that you don't underestimate the importance of those mistakes. And the other thing that I think that is crucially important but often under-recognized is improvising, is becoming an expert improviser. And I think improvising often has a bad name because it sounds sort of not thought through, or too lazy to do it properly, so you improvise. I don't think it's that at all. I think improvising in the sense of bringing into play at any moment without warning all that stuff that you've spent years gathering, but doing the right thing with it to address whatever context you're in. And I think that ability to improvise is a hallmark of becoming expert. And so we're going to be exploring some of those sort of crucial points in the pathway that leads to mastery. And one way of looking at mastery is to say that you're very good at what you've learned to do and you're helping other people get there too. But another aspect, I think, is when you take your work in a new direction. And a number of the people we'll be talking to today have done exactly that, have started to take their work itself in new directions. But I thought I'd just give you a glimpse of the kind of approach I've taken in this book for people who haven't had a chance to look at it. And for people who haven't had a chance to look at it and would like to, I should point out that we'll have copies of that book here if people would like to get hold of a copy later. But I thought I'd just take you back for a moment or two to an experience I had in my own training as a medical student, where I was grappling with some of the things that we're going to start exploring in a minute with Joshua. And I've called it Space and Other People. So I've said back to Manchester Royal Infirmary, this time in 1976. It's in the middle of the night, and I'm a medical student. I'm fast asleep when my pager goes off. I'm a bit more experienced than when I started learning to take blood, but I'm still a medical student, and now I'm on my maternity attachment. I've been hauled out of bed to repair an episiotomy. That's the scissor cut into a woman's vagina, which a midwife or obstetrician sometimes has to make during delivery. Its purpose is to release tension and minimize the chances of the baby's head splitting important structures such as the mother's anal sphincter. And I'd learned how to make these cuts when I was delivering babies. But then I found out the hard way that episiotomies are easier to make than to repair. So at that time, students were often called at night to sew up episiotomies because nobody else wanted to do it. The excitement of bringing a baby into the world had simmered down, patients usually exhausted. And of course, repairing a cut like this is crucial for the patient later on. It can have a major impact on on a mother's continence and sexual function. So it's really important. And I'm painfully aware that I need to get things right, but I'm not sure how. So part of this is about having a system to work with. When I started repairing episiotomies, I'd shake the instruments out of their sterile pack and make a start. But each time I needed to pick up the needle holder or grab another swab, I had to take my eye off my patient as I cast about amongst the clutter. And when I looked again, the bleeding point would have vanished from view and I'd be back at square one. So one night, a kindly midwife saw me struggling. She came over and she explained how to set things out into a logical sequence so I could put my hand on what I needed almost without looking. She asked if I was right or left-handed and then showed me how to ensure the essential instruments were within easy reach. It made a huge difference. And from then on, I laid out each pack in the same order. Eventually, it became second nature, and I didn't even register I was doing it. In retrospect, this approach seems so obvious that I can't understand why I didn't realize it from the start. But at the time, it wasn't obvious. None of the doctors ever mentioned it. It took someone else to point it out before the penny dropped. And even then, nobody gave it a name. Years later, I learned that chefs describe this as mise en place, a French expression meaning organizing your workplace. This is a fundamental principle in the high-pressure world of the restaurant kitchen, where everything depends on split-second timing and flawless coordination. But mise en place is not just for the kitchen. It's how we can get into an unfamiliar car, identify the controls for headlights, indicators, and horn, and drive. Yet small departures from what you're used to can still throw you off balance. An unfamiliar mise en place takes time to adjust to. And anyone who's driven a hired car will know how easy it is to find that you've turned on the windscreen wipers instead of indicating a turn. So I use that as an example of a principle that I didn't see at the time as a principle. It never occurred to me that there was such a principle, but many of the people in this room I've had conversations with over the last few years have said very similar things. You talk to anybody in a carpenter's workshop or wood engraver's workshop or a biology lab at a university or a chemistry, all sorts of places. People are aware, even if not by that name, of this idea of orderliness and planning. But to me, working with chefs and recognizing that this idea had a term, and it was something that in the world of the kitchen, you learn that from day one. You don't wait until you've been doing your work for 15 years and then wish you'd heard about it earlier. And so it really pointed out to me the value, excuse me, of having conversations with people from completely different areas, because what they think is important may not be what you think is important. And together you can come up with different ways of seeing things. So, so I'm going to stop talking now and invite the first of our speakers, Joshua Byrne, to come and sit down here. And we're going to have a conversation which I hope will lead to a broader discussion as time goes on. So Joshua, welcome. Joshua, if those of you who've read my book will be well aware of Joshua because his story runs through the book. I think it's going to be easier if we do this.
Okay.
It doesn't work like that.
Like that, okay.
Which is something that's going to apply to everybody when we open up a conversation. Joshua, I said you were a bespoke tailor. Say a little bit about what that is.
Well, so bespoke tailor is somebody that makes clothes for people that are individual to that person. And the degree to which that's the case varies quite widely between practitioners, but
This is on.
Okay.
Oh, so my demonstration earlier didn't work. So you need to point it at your mouth and make sure it's on, and then it will work. Yeah. Okay. So a bespoke tailor, because when we first met, which was over 10 years ago, I had a vague idea that bespoke just meant high quality, but it's not that at all. Is it? I mean, no. It is that, but it's much more than that.
The quality is to a degree an irrelevance, because the bespoke part of it is the degree to which you customize the thing to the person, the garment to the person, rather than the way that rather than the level it's made at. They happen to coincide because customization is generally expensive. So as a result, it has to be of equally high quality in order for it to be sellable.
And so now, as a bespoke tailor, as I understand it, people come to you and they say they want a suit or a jacket or something, and you, I know, try very hard to find out, before jumping into details, you try and find out what they want.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to find out the problem they're trying to solve with the garment that you're going to make for them. So that's kind of the starting point, to work out what the situation is for, the life they lead, where they live, the climatic realities of where they live, and the social and how the tastes of the place they live will affect it.
And so that's what you're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't, I imagine, what you were doing right at the very beginning when you became a tailor. So how did you become a tailor to begin with?
Well, so there are two types of tailoring. I first started as a making tailor, and that was really luck. I went to the cinema and there was a scene with a tailor, and I left university to do it. It was the making side of it is kind of more what you were describing earlier. So it's not thinking at all about the person it's for. It's the process of making it.
So when you say a making tailor, you mean somebody who actually physically makes jackets, puts bits together and sews them up and stuff.
Exactly. So you have the making tailors and the cutting tailors, and the cutting tailors are the ones that interact with the customers and solve the problems on that end, and the making tailors are the ones that put it together under the
But
guidance.
I know you did an apprenticeship in both.
Yeah.
But your first apprenticeship was as a making.
Yeah, and generally that's the way around you would go. It would be. Some people don't do both, but it would be very rare to do a making apprenticeship after a cutting apprenticeship.
And that was a number of years, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's 4 years. It's usually between 4 and 5 years. It depends a bit. But.
So in those 4 or 5 years, what are you doing as an apprentice making tailor?
So at the beginning, it's pretty basic because you've got no skills at all, and so it's cutting the interlinings, cutting the pocketings, padding those, making pocket flaps, sewing on buttons, turning.
So I know you've got a jacket that's sort of half made there. Could you bring it over and we'll just have a look at it maybe? It might be easier if I hold the microphone in front of your mouth, and then you can maybe tell people. So what are we looking at here, Josh?
There's 2 jackets. I've got one which is much earlier, which is a basted jacket. So this is literally made as little as possible to be able to put it on the person's back and give a representation of what it would look like, but leaving as much scope for change as possible. And so inside, these little stitches, padding stitches, are the types of things you do when you first start. The putting them together before you do that would be a much later stage, because you have to get length. There's different layers inside. So you've got different layers of horsehair and canvas inside, and they all have to be longer. And so you have to put them on long and then shrink them onto the.
So you're having to, I mean, presumably when you very first started, you didn't know how to use a needle and thread. You didn't know how to do any of these things.
Exactly. When you first start, you're just given a piece of fabric and told to sew like that, but not worrying about rolling the material. Later on, you roll the material in order to get the interlining to shape, to be domed, so that when it's the other way around, it's domed around the chest.
So there's all sorts of stuff that does important things later, but maybe you don't even realize at the time what those things are. Is that right?
Exactly.
I'm going to see if I can use 2 microphones. It's complicated, isn't it? So it's going to be an interesting one. So we need somebody who has circus skills, I think, mostly. So this didn't happen overnight, did it? You getting good at things. This was presumably something that you had to do stuff again and again and again, as I was saying, even though you didn't understand why.
Often you can't tell the difference between when you're doing it right and wrong. It's the person that's teaching you that's telling you, and usually it's telling you doing it wrong rather than right. So people tend to focus on telling you the bad things rather than the good things.
And so do they tell you why it's wrong, or do they just tell you it's wrong?
Hopefully, but not always.
Not always. Okay.
So often there's not time. They're in a rush. They're doing their job. They're not. They don't necessarily value your time at that point. So it's more a question of go away and fix it, rather than this is how you go away.
I mean, it chimes with my experience as a medical student and a junior doctor. I don't know if other people have similar experiences in their own areas of expertise, but that idea that you just have to do stuff lots and lots of times and people come and tell you it's not right, but you have to find out for yourself why not sometimes. But the point I was making earlier about things looking different in retrospect from how they did at the time is something that came out of conversations that you and I had. You were talking about pocket flaps, for example, weren't you? About having to do something again and again and again and again and again, even though you could find that pretty boring. But actually, looking back on it, it turned out to have done things you didn't know it was doing at the time.
No, exactly. I mean, when you're doing pocket flap, when you first do it, you're effectively just hoping that you have the same amount of cloth showing on the back of it all the way around. But what you're also trying to do is to get it to go around the body so that when it's on the body, it lays flat rather than kicking out. That then leads into the front of the jacket, which is much more vital that it does it, that the whole jacket wants to turn in. And the skills that you learn in order to try to get the pocket flap to mold around the body apply when you're doing the main jacket. And if you don't get to grips with it, then it's very unlikely you'll get to grips with it.
Oh, it's the same principle on a part of the thing for the whole of the thing. But you can't start off by wanting to get it curved. You have to start off by learning just to do it. Is that right? Yeah.
Then the person teaching you will take away what you've done and fiddle around with it so that it's as it should be and then put it in. But you don't always get told what you haven't done. And you just constantly trying to do it and do it and do it until you understand.
So you're dealing with part of the picture, whereas the person who's more experienced can see a bigger picture.
Yeah.
So were you aware of a time that came when you started to move from that small picture and see how it all fitted together?
Not necessarily. It wasn't like there was a day of epiphany or something like that. It was more of a gradual process that, and then all of a sudden you realize that you know what it is that you're trying to do. But it wasn't like there was a certain moment. It's more in retrospect that you notice.
But I think, certainly from my experience, you can't sort of leapfrog that time and get to the point where you suddenly understand how it all fits together. You have to go through that stage.
Well, exactly. And for example, when you're cutting, one of the most important things is trying to understand what's a cutting fault and what's a making fault, because they can show themselves the same. And if it's the time spent padding and sewing on collars and understanding the tensions of the fabrics that allows you then to feel that later.
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting at. So there's something then about all this repetitive work giving you experience of what different kinds of fabrics in your case feel like, and different tensions and all those things that you can't get from reading a book.
No, exactly. So one of the most important things on a jacket is putting the collar on, and if this is too tight, it will look as if you've got the structure of the cutting wrong, but it's not. It's got nothing to do with that. So, but if you can't tell that from the tension of the collar that the collar's too tight, you'll end up adjusting the jacket. And then if the person puts the collar on correctly, you're going to end up with where it's too far the other way. So it's very hard to judge accurately what the adjustment needed is if you can't understand.
So you have to have an understanding in your body and your hands of what's actually going on in order to recognize what problems are later, for example.
Yeah.
But I remember you told me, well, you said that you hadn't always wanted to be a tailor, and I think you were studying at university at the time when you saw that film you mentioned. Yeah. Because the kind of studying at universities is different in a way, isn't it, from this kind of work? Because that's about sort of learning concepts. And this, it seems to me, you grasped the concept long before you could actually do the work.
Yeah, I mean, I found it quite a challenge, to be honest, when I first started, because it felt quite tedious, because you're used to, from an academic point of view, from my experience of it, that you learn something and you know it, and then you learn something else, and then you keep on adding to it, and you're building up a bigger and bigger picture. With this, you learn it, and then you have to repeat it endlessly, even though you know it. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So I don't know if this is raising any sort of echoes in the experience of people in the room, but it certainly did to me when we started talking about that. And I guess the other thing was the question of being bored.
It is very boring, but it kind of goes. My son's 5 years old, and he's learning to write at the moment, and it's the same thing because he needs to get to control his fingers in the way that I did when I was sewing, and for him it's really boring. But later on, when he's writing stories, he won't be thinking about writing those letters. It's the same when you're making. When you first start, it's really tedious because all you're concentrating on is the act of sewing. You're not thinking about what you're doing with the piece of fabric when you're sewing it.
Yeah.
It's a completely different interaction.
But
you need to go through one to get to the other.
And again, you can't leapfrog it.
No.
I mean, I think there's another thing that Joshua and I have talked about before, which is the need to develop the capacity to cope with being bored. And because some things are just boring, aren't they? Other things, I remember you said that you had a moment where you decided you could reframe things.
Yeah. It was playing cricket, and I went back to cricket, and I quite like batting and bowling, but found fielding incredibly tedious. And then realised that most of the time you play cricket is fielding. So either you need to find a way to enjoy it, or you might as well do something else. And so that was a moment that then kind of fed back into the work and made you realise that it's finding ways to engage with it, even if it on the surface is incredibly tedious.
Because you've got to do it anyway.
Yeah.
So
find a
either
way to enjoy it.
Either you can resent it,
yeah,
or you can find a way
and generally, if you resent it, you're probably not going to progress that quickly.
Yeah. So there's this stage then of just doing stuff again and again and again. And did you find that you were sort of disconnecting your brain while you were doing that, or were you, did it become a sort of automatic thing, or were you using it as a way of getting better?
So there were two distinct things between when I resented it, you completely disengage and you listen to the radio and you're not actually developing at all. And then when you are able to kind of reframe it for yourself, then you do engage with it much more quickly and you develop much more quickly, I found. So.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the different nature of materials. I know in the world of medicine, people talk about how you put up a drip or how you suture somebody or something like that, and it seems as if these things are always the same. And once you've learned to do it, you've learned to do it. But actually, of course, everybody's different. And so, taking blood from somebody or putting up an infusion is very different indeed from a small child, from a healthy adult or a very sick elderly person or whatever, or even different people. Everybody's different. And it's really only by doing it loads of times on loads of people that you develop that sort of understanding of the world that you're working with physically. And you can judge that. And I wondered, here you are with one jacket, but I know you use all sorts of cloths and textiles and sort of all these interlinings you've talked about. Is there something there of having to just spend time with these different materials to learn how they work?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there are kind of major categories. So vegetable fibers behave quite differently from animal fibers, but then even within those, there are lots of sub-varieties. And so, for example, when you're putting in the sleeve is always bigger than the hole it goes into, but the degree to which it's bigger is determined by the material itself. So you can cut a pattern and you can cut the sleeve out, but it's only when you start to put it in that you understand exactly how much can go in, and so you have to adjust as you go along. So even as a cutter now, I can't say to the person, put it in exactly as I've cut it, because when they're actually sewing the sleeve, they'll know the properties of the cloth and may have to adjust the sleeve as they're doing it.
Oh, so have I got this right? There's stuff that you can't know until you get there. I mean, you can know that there is stuff that you can't know until you get there, but you can't quite know what that is, if that doesn't sound too complicated. Should we rewind that one a bit? What I mean is that there is implicit, inherent uncertainty in dealing with, I suppose, with all kinds of materials, but here you are with textiles, whether they're cotton or wool or whatever, and you have to be able to judge that in the moment and respond.
You do if you're trying to make the most of each particular type of material. So if you're doing something in a more mechanized basis, you'll take the worst case scenario. So you take the cloth that you can do the least manipulation with, and you'd apply it to everything, because that's the easy solution. But if you want to make the most of each particular material, you need to treat each one differently. And so you have to have the scope within your process and the people you work with to adjust as you go along with the material.
So you have to have developed the sensibilities to recognize these small differences between materials and tools.
But even then, you know, as a having been a making tailor, if I'm cutting out a cotton suit, I can make my best guess, but each piece of cotton is slightly different. Different manufacturers will weave with different tensions. There'll be different finishes, different dyes behave differently. So the darker the dye, the less soft the cloth feels, and it behaves differently. And so I have to keep scope and allow for the people that are making the garments I now cut to allow them to adjust with me and obviously discuss between us so we know what's changing.
Oh, so this is a collaborative thing between you essentially as a cutting tailor, if I've got this right, you're the sort of designer or the...
That seems like a strong step.
Well, I mean, you're sort of, you're cutting it out and designing what it's going to look like, and then somebody else makes it. But you need to understand about both those things so that you can have conversations. And you're having multiple conversations, and you're having conversations with the making tailors who are out of view, and also conversations with your customer or your client about how, I mean, if somebody...
Because you have to manage their expectation as well, because if they've had a tweed overcoat, which you can pretty much do whatever you want with the fabric, because you can shrink it and stretch it all over the place. And then the next time they come in and they want a silk jacket for the summer, what you can do is completely different. And so, but you don't want to be limited. For me, I don't want to make the tweed jacket as the silk one in order that I can meet their expectation. I'd prefer to meet the expectation through discussion.
So one of the crucial aspects of you being the expert that you are is the human relationship between you and your customers, then, isn't it?
Between both.
Yes.
Between the makers and the customers.
Yes. Yeah. Fascinating. So I think that's a good point at which to pause and sort of open things up for discussion and conversation with the group. So if you'd like to make a comment or a contribution, put your hand up, and Emily over here will take a microphone and she will ask you to point it directly at your mouth as I'm pointing mine to mine, and make sure that it's on. And that will work well for the Zoom audience as well as everyone in the room. But it depends on somebody raising a hand. There we are. Kevin. Oh, could I ask everybody, could I ask you just to say who you are?
Kevin Buzzard. I have a very low tolerance for boredom. And when I find I'm doing something boring, my first question is, could this be better done by a machine? And can machines do the boring parts?
So I'm not sure. Just say that again for the Zoom while we're testing it out. So you've got a very low tolerance for boredom. Every time you get something boring, you think, couldn't someone or something else do it instead? A machine. Could a machine do what you're talking about?
No, because the machine can't vary the tension. So the tension machine is set when you set it up. So for example, when you're padding the canvases in here, the tension of the stitch has to be quite loose. Otherwise, you won't be able to stretch and mold the shape of the chest. So there are people that use machine padded canvases, but they have a completely different character. What's that, sorry? Well, to a limited degree, when you're first doing it and you're just told that not to do it tight, it's not as if there's endless variation. So, and in a way, it means it's very slow, because it's not like you can just pull your stitch through quickly, because you have to pull it slowly so that you can leave a little bit of ease.
So I mean, it's the nature of your work that determines this. I mean, many clothes are made by machine, aren't they? So,
well, a lot of clothes are stuck together. So there are variations from one to another. I mean, to give you an example, in a machine-made jacket made in a factory in Portugal, the average making time from cutting the cloth to the finished garment is 90 minutes.
Whereas in your work?
About 60 hours.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the idea of boredom in mastery or proficiency, because it seems to me that you just can't get there unless you're willing to tolerate boredom. And just because of the hours involved of doing repetitive tasks that you see top sports people doing, it's just hours and hours and hours of things that are really, really boring in order to be able to produce under pressure on a public stage, or in your case, to deliver a jacket that fits and that the client is crazy about. And the flip side of that is, how am I working with myself and my motivation in order to handle boredom over a long period of time? Because I can't just be bored, right? I have to find ways of moving myself through the boredom to continue to do the thing. And the example that really struck me was in the Jordan documentary, The Last Dance. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So Michael Jordan, basketballer, people know reasonably well. What really struck me was how he used anger consistently throughout that process to stay motivated, because his job was basically put a ball in a hoop, right? Over 20 years to do that at a high level is mastering motivation and handling boredom. Any thoughts about that?
I think from my point of view in my career now, rather than necessarily, because obviously the apprentice stage is quite short, relatively speaking, 4 or 5 years for the making apprenticeship. Over a longer period of time, the thing that's nice for me is that there's never a perfect garment. So in a way, you're kind of chastening an illusion that whatever you make, it will never be perfect, because there are always compromises between aesthetics and comforts, from what the material can do. So it's the very fact that if you can never get to that perfect thing that keeps driving you on.
I mean, I know that certainly came out from many of the conversations I had when writing this book, and several of the people in the room here at the moment said similar things. Andrew Davidson over there, who's been a wood engraver for decades, said something very similar along the lines of I've never made a perfect print, but I'll never stop trying to make one. And lots of people have said very similar things, giving that sense that you may be able to see where it all started, but you don't see where it ends, because it doesn't end. And I guess that's what you were saying, Ed, about keeping your motivation and finding ways to continue continue being engaged with it, because you could just cut off, couldn't you, and think about something else all the time, and it could become really boring and repetitive. But I think the people in this room, being expert, I think, to me, one of the characteristics of being expert is being able to continue to develop and not stagnate.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the way that people live is constantly changing. So the garments you're making need to react to that. And so as a result, the work you're doing is also changing. So for example, the way that you cut trousers, historically, they were made to have a lot of movement. Then up until very recently, they were made to look a certain way when you're stood still in front of a mirror, because that's how people judge them. And now, because over the last couple of years, for obvious reasons, people want to have more movement in their clothes again. And so as a result, you need to adapt and adjust and find new ways of doing your work in order to accommodate it.
I think we've got time for another couple of points if people would like to make them. Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Tabitha, and I am both a musician and a rare books librarian. So I recognize very much what you're talking about in terms of repetition of very boring things. You have to do that certainly on a classical stringed instrument for hours and hours and hours. And then there's always the fall below that level under the pressure of performance. But I was interested when you talked about your experience of university. You acquire knowledge and you acquire more knowledge, and that's it. And I just wanted to say that I think the pattern of this 3-stage journey, Roger, that you're talking about is very often underestimated when it comes to intellectual activities, such as thinking and writing. But actually, certainly, I'm from a humanities background, and you can put me right on how it works from the sciences. But from a humanities background, you're doing that as you go through the university system. You start off being told what to read, and you have to read it, you summarize it, you practice précis, you practice translation, you practice your formal logic formulae, whatever it is that you're studying. Then you get to your journeyman position when you're really trying to explore how that relates to an audience and you're writing or publishing. When you finally get to the top level, you're able to really experiment with patterns of thinking, patterns of putting an argument together, and patterns of presenting new ideas and new thinking to different types of audience, or the way that you put together an argument when you're writing from an opinion piece or an academic article. I just wanted to say that because I think it's very often underestimated, the emphasis that we have now on using the word information and knowledge, I think misses out learning how to think.
I think it's a fascinating point. Josh, do you want to respond to that in an hour?
I mean, obviously for me, I left university to become a tailor, so I didn't really go through all of that. So, but all I can say is that there was a distinct difference from my point of view in terms of the mental stimulation of learning things, learning concepts and adding to that constantly than there was to padding a canvas for hours and hours.
Although, I mean, I absolutely understand what you mean, Tabitha, and certainly from my experience, I think the process of writing has been a very interesting one, because I think that is a craft and has many similarities. And I think you have to do an awful lot of boring, repetitive work that nobody else is interested in, nor you, for a long, long time before you get to the point where it becomes fit to be seen and read by other people. Actually, Connor, can I ask you, Connor over here is at Penguin Books, you must see loads and loads and loads of authors of various kinds. Have you got any comments about how that works with people? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. Hello. Yes, I'm Connor Brown, editor at Penguin. I think that, yeah, I see that all of the time. I think that redoing things over and over and over again is essentially what editing is. It's just doing the boring thing so that it's presentable to other people. So yeah, I think that translates perfectly into the book world. I see it every day.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more. Who's that over there? Emily, this one over there. Oh, right over in the corner. Yeah. It's David.
Thank you.
Yes,
I'm
please.
David Dolan. It's interesting that many of us are turning around this question of boredom and how to deal with it for a reason, I'm sure. But I wanted to ask you, is it the case that when you were dealing with the boredom, was the element of effortlessness a part of going forward? And if so, was it turning the boring a bit less boring? And I'm thinking of practicing scales, which can be very boring or horribly very boring, until you begin perhaps to listen to the goal point of the scale, changing it, and somehow, apropos your point before of having to deal with that, or else you have to start doing something else.
So have I got this right? You're saying, does there come a time when you start to see differently those things that to begin with seem just inexpressibly tedious, like practicing scales or pocket flaps or whatever? Can you turn that into something that seems to you to be of greater value?
Yes, but also I'm thinking about the effortlessness as both something you're looking for and as a way out of the trap of boredom.
The idea of effortlessness.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I understand that exactly, but what I would say is that there is a moment where the mechanical, as we discussed earlier, the mechanical skills of doing something, you don't notice anymore, and you're noticing how you're manipulating your work, and that is when the boredom of doing the task goes.
So there's a transition. First of all, you've got this narrow focus on the thing itself, but then it becomes just part of a bigger picture of the work that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Like writing letters.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
All you're thinking about is to get the right shape and the tail coming off the right height and things like that. And then eventually you're writing, and what you're what you're interested in is expressing what you're trying to write, not.
And then you get to what Tabitha was talking about writing things from. Yeah, excellent. We could go on talking for a very long time, but we can't because we need to move on. So thank you, Joshua, very much indeed for a fascinating talk. And so now we're just going to have 2 minutes. What I would like you to do, please, is to stand up and move your legs and arms around. And I mean this very seriously, because otherwise we'll all get, our blood will coagulate, and so will our thinking processes. Well, welcome. Is this working? Yeah, good. So welcome back, everybody. And thank you to Joshua for that last session. And now we're going to move on to a rather different aspect to explore. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Fabrice Renge, who is a hairstylist, from whom I have learned a great deal. And so Fabrice, say a little bit about who you are.
Yes, that's why we try not to be boring, because boredom is something we don't like. That's why everybody knows that in our job, we got to get the passion in terms of being able to translate. My job is to make people happy, solve the problem. That's why after I cut hair, you cut textile, you do whatever you like, but the aim is to make sure that you solve the problem. And I was bored at school. That's why I decided to do something that I enjoyed at the time, which was related to the musical scene and the street culture. That's why I was fascinated with those shapes, volumes, and obviously trends. And obviously, I went through the boring side of my job, but again, boring is not necessarily boring because it's challenging. And if it's boring, you need to change your job, because obviously it's part of the exercise to at some point to question yourself and not necessarily liking it, what you're doing, but you got to understand why you don't like it and what to do to improve, to make it interesting. And that takes time. And obviously sometimes you think, am I really going to do that? Am I made for that? Even after a few years of career. And obviously you got always continue, recycle yourself, question yourself, and try some new tools, some new way to express yourself.
And so you're a hairstylist. When I first encountered Fabrice, he was in charge of the staff training for the Tony and Guy Training Academy. Now I know you've moved on to a slightly different area of work, which we can talk about in a minute. But at that stage, you had yourself gone through many of these stages that we talked about in terms of becoming an expert stylist, but you were also teaching other stylists. So say a little bit about how you got to that stage of being let's say, a competent stylist, because I think it raises all sorts of interesting parallels that I noticed with my early years as a clinician, particularly in terms of how you develop the confidence to deal with people, with clients, in my case, with patients. Say a little bit about how you became, in those first years, a stylist.
Yeah, that's why this you don't improvise yourself. That's why you need hours of flight. You need to do a lot of clients. You need to do a lot of hours and a lot of years. And after, I would say, a good 10 years, I started to be a bit more comfortable with all type of hair texture. And after I started to travel the world and to be able to, even not talking the language still now, but obviously with my body language, be able to do a consultation to solve and make the people happy. That's why after, by doing mistakes, you learn and you can teach people how not to do mistakes. That's the main thing.
Because when we were talking just now with Joshua about the challenge being not so much to be able to do it, although that is important, but to work out what is the problem that somebody wanted solved. Our conversations made me think about the process you go through when you first see somebody, trying to work out what they want to look like and what you can do to meet them in those needs, because they don't always coincide, do they?
True. That's why in that case, we got some common thing with the magician. Obviously, you need to be able to translate and understand the demand of the client. That's why when it's possible, you do it, and the client is very happy. And when it's not possible, the client can be still happy because we explain to her why it cannot work and what you can do even better to improve what the client asked for. In terms of length, we got the solution. In terms of color, in terms of hair texture, we can do anything now. That's why you need to have the right diagnostic, the right consultation, and the right expertise to be able to translate and to do the work.
But because it seems to me that there are interesting parallels between what Joshua does in working with three-dimensional living human beings and doing things to change their appearance, and what you do with living, breathing human beings in 3 dimensions, because you're having to make expert judgments, aren't you, about what somebody looks like and balance that with what they want to look like and what you know you can make them look like. And all those things are, they're variables, aren't they?
Exactly. That's why first you need to be able to, as I say, I repeat myself, but it's most important to understand clients. And this is obviously take years to be able to read the person with the psychomorphology, with the face shape. I can see if someone obviously with a certain, with the body language and the face shape, I can see straight away. Sometimes I'm wrong, but I can see what will work perfectly within the hair texture and the hair density and the length.
So you're, have I got this right? You're making judgments about the sort of physicality of I can't do it on myself because I haven't got any, but you know, the sort of consistency and length and color and all those characteristics of hair, with which are changeable, with the head shape and face, which is pretty much not changeable. You know, what people are with skull shape and things like that, but also you're trying to gauge that person's personality and how what you can do will shape how they see themselves. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's correct. And some people, they're more conservative, some people a bit more flamboyant. That's why to express their personality or their comfort zone and security within the job they do, the lifestyle they got. That's why even the haircut will be perfect, that won't be the right haircut. You need to be able to translate and to understand the needs of the people and not doing the most beautiful color and haircut in the world. First, a client can come to you because obviously she wants to look the same all their life because they image. And some of them, they want to change every second, every minute. I'm exaggerating, but those days, some people very versatile, or on the other hand, boring, maybe, but conservative, and they don't want to change. And they got their reason. And you need to accept this because we do that mistake, saying, oh, this person is boring, I don't like this style. That's why I learned me to like what I dislike. Means that when I don't like a type of client with a type of hair that is challenging, and that makes me even more, let's say, powerful to be able to solve that problem and to make those people happy.
So
and
you
myself.
You see it as a challenge.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's what it's all about. Challenge always, every day, every morning. You need to have a goal, and that's make you going. If not, you're bored. And as I say, after lots of people everywhere, any profession, they are bored every day.
So okay, good. So it's a good starting point. So when we first started talking, I started to see parallels between what you do and what I had done in my own experience, which I wasn't expecting to see. And one of them, the first one I think I noticed was what you do with with scissors and things, because I'd done stuff with scissors when I was doing surgery. You do stuff with scissors. Can you give a glimpse of the kind of way you hold your scissors and do things?
Yes.
Because it
Because
struck me very early on.
So, yeah,
I'll hold that,
because
because I know you need 3 hands to hold it.
I need to stand up because my profession obviously starting need to have obviously ergonomy, the movements first for health and safety, and second the way you will approach the client. So with this, I can go anywhere, I can travel the world, I can live my life anywhere I go. I can cut hair because hair is growing. That's why the most important, the most important is not how much you cut, is how much hair you leave. That's why first to hold the comb, obviously, it's the way to hold the comb to be able to manipulate. You've got the part to section the hair to divide because it's with some sectioning pattern to able to create the shape. And after a different way to comb the hair with the fine teeth for the same tension or the white teeth to have a bit more movement. That's why it's depending of the hair density. And after the scissors, same as Josh, obviously the scissors. Everybody cut hair before, no one, but you cut something, paper. And when you hold the blades, obviously, it's not like my friend earlier on, it's a bit more like this, and you got just one blade who's moving. That's why that way you need to be able to manipulate first from health and safety while you move around the head to create obviously some shapes and to cut obviously some areas, especially around the ear. That's why Roger is not my client, but he could be my client. And if he's coming, what are we do? Not a transformation, but a maintenance. And he will feel good because he won't have any here around the sides here, which I need to have done. That's why everybody needs a haircut at some point. But again, the way you manipulate the scissor with the angle. That's why to cut by texturizing. Texturizing means to cut into the hair to increase the texture and the volume. That's why depending on the angle you create, you can modulate and create obviously a better hair growth. Because if you cut just straight, that would be nice, but when you grow, that will be always blunt and thick and heavy. That's why you see, that's why my client with the bob shape, they're coming every 3 weeks, because it's nice, actually, maintenance, and to cut everything nice and sharp. And some of them, they don't have the budget, or they don't want to come to see me because they find it boring to see the hairdresser. That's why the hair grows nicely after 3 months. That's why the way to manipulate the blades to create some shape, we allowed a better regrowth into the total style. So all of you went to see a barber or a hairdresser or your mom or your brother, sister cut your hair, and you can notice the difference, I hope, in between a good stylist and your mom, which is talented too. But again, sometimes that can be a disaster because she doesn't have the technique. That's why before going to the filling, the final product sometimes can be amazing because the shape is fantastic. But the time after, without the technique, you cannot reproduce it. That's why it's important to have this method, this technique to be able to have the longevity and the consistency during the work. And it's what happened to me when I was younger. Not much education. I was on the shop floor 3 years after my apprenticeship. That's why sometimes my haircut, wow, and sometimes catastrophic because I didn't have the experience. When I mean catastrophic, for me, after, of course, she was happy to pay. But with your... with your expertise, with your eyes, and after when you became older, and because I became an educator, now I see some mistakes that even not a hairdresser can see. That's why after is with experience, with the advanced cutting skills, as we call it in our jargon, people paying a lot of money, even they are already hairdresser, to train some new techniques and to be able to work on the millimeter, which is something not only to satisfy ourselves, but obviously, as I said, the hair will grow better and the client won't see it, but she will notice, especially during the lockdown. So sorry, some of my clients who came after the lockdown, 3 months after, and they say to me, flattering, oh, that was nice, that grew nicely. And obviously, some of them, I have to cut it myself. That wasn't me. No, I'm joking. I'm not pretentious. But obviously, they cut it themselves, and that was horrendous. And when it's growing, that's the problem. That's why you need to work on a long term. It's not only this day, it's after, it's not the final product, and after it's through the years, through the month, and after through the years, when you got obviously your client coming. I've got some clients, I do the hair since 25 years, and it's always something you can add on and something you can improve.
So that's a really, you've raised lots of interesting things that I'd like to talk about. One of them, actually, just before you go any further, what you were doing with your scissors there. I mean, when I was doing surgery, I used to think that surgeons were pretty good with scissors, and I wasn't too bad myself. But just seeing you manipulate those instruments and the sort of snippety snip kind of things, as we used to say in the surgical world, those things, those are skills that, just seeing you do that while you were talking, doing them automatically almost, made me realize that there are these very strong parallels between something that actually takes a very long time to learn, because it isn't easy to do that, is it? And certainly isn't easy to even to manipulate scissors and a comb like that, let alone to get them to do what you want to do. So there's that side of things that is very interesting, I think. But there's also what you were saying about looking in a longer term. Because I'd thought of hairstyling as somebody comes in and you cut their hair and they go out and that's it. But actually you're thinking about how it's going to develop over the next few weeks and months, aren't you? Rather, I suppose, as you might think about how somebody's going to recover from a surgical procedure or something like that. But certainly this idea that it isn't just a one-off thing and that's it, but you're thinking ahead. And I guess you can only do that when you've had a lot of experience of observing how people's hair grows and what it does. So tell me a little bit about that long-term thing, because you could get somebody, I guess, who went out of your salon immediately and quite pleased, but a short time later, it wasn't so good. Whereas for other people, if you've been able to think ahead and put that into effect, then it will last much longer.
That's correct. So obviously, by mistake, you learn, as I say. That's why educate yourself by educating other people. That's why cutting a fringe too short at the beginning, that could be shocking. But after, all the environment say, oh, that suits you. And that happened to me. I did that mistake, cutting on wet hair and with the tension that dried. And obviously, that was too short. And the client obviously not happy. But coming back and asking for the same the next time, because at the end, that suits the person. That's why sometimes you can do something that is working perfectly and the client is not happy. Why? Because it's not her desire. That's why it's the most difficult in between having the knowledge, the technical skills to translate to the human, the individual within the psychological.
Thank you. Options are dwindling here now, aren't they? Really? So I was going to ask you about something that actually, why don't we sit down? Something that I remember was quite a challenge when I was a medical student, which was, and which I gradually got the hang of through doing stuff like taking blood from people and things like that, was to become gradually comfortable into moving into the personal space of somebody I'd never met, and getting them to have enough confidence to allow me, in my case, to do something that was uncomfortable, say like taking blood or whatever. And in your case, I guess, could change their appearance in ways that they either did or did not like. But looking back on it, it took quite a while to become comfortable with that. And I think only by becoming comfortable could I make my patients feel comfortable. And it wasn't something that was ever talked about or written about in textbooks or anything. I kind of just did it. And I wondered how you did that, because you must get used to, or must invite people to allow you to approach them and to touch them and do all kinds of things that, to begin with, can be quite a challenge.
For me, that was exactly because with my age group, when I started, I was young. And when I had my client, who was my posh Parisian client, very obviously, and that wasn't my scene at all, obviously. That's why that was a bit impressive. That's why the only person, I don't know you, but if I touch your hair, even now, I'm a hairdresser, you say, oh, what he's doing? That's why the only person who can touch your hair is your husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, relative, mom. But if you got someone who's coming straight away and touching your head, it's not good at all, especially with the distance. It's not a lot of people who can approach people from very close, because it can be very uncomfortable if I come to you straight away, even you know me now. That's why you need to have exactly a bit of distance, because that way you're a bit more in a comfort zone. If you're too close, obviously you start to be myself. I don't like people who are close to me. I need to have a bit of distance. That's why about this. That's why the only person who can come very, very close to you is someone you trust, like your doctor, like your dentist, or a hairdresser. But before the person knows you, obviously, you need to have an approach. So that takes time. But first, to gain, obviously, the confidence, and that takes time. That's the problem. That's why first, slowly, one of my work colleagues asked me, because me straight away, I was going to the person and touching the head straight away, which is wrong. First, you need to approach slowly, eye contact, and see how the person reacts. And within the eye contact, after closer, and starting to touch the shoulder, and that's what way first touch, and sometimes touching the shoulder, because when you put the gown on the client, health and safety, you got to put some gown to protect, to don't have the hair going everywhere. That's why you got to touch at some point the person. And by putting the gown on when I was an assistant, I started to touch some ladies and boys, obviously, and they allowed me. If not, before, I wouldn't be able to touch anyone. And even yourself, you won't let me. And me too, I won't feel comfortable if someone is touching me. That's why that takes time, but within the professional environment, it is easier. And as I say, the client is coming, and instead of obviously being shy, you can just engage the conversation, as we call always the boring conversation. That is, how are you today? How can I help you? And yeah, and after, as we discussed a few times, if the person starts to speak about the weather, she needs to talk. And if someone starts to talk about more specific.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one about, that's an interesting one about talking for a couple of reasons. One is that to begin with, it's quite difficult to walk and chew gum at the same time, isn't it? You know, when you're focusing on physical skills, it's quite difficult to have your enough attentional capacity to read somebody else. But also, in my experience, which is quite a long way out of date now of going to hairdressers, they were always, but dredging back into those distant times, they would normally start talking about football, and it didn't really land with me because I'm not interested in football. And then they try talking about something else, and so I was very struck that the good ones would very quickly, they'd try one or two things, and they'd quickly make a judgment about whether I wanted to talk or not, whether I wanted to listen to them talk or not, and they would usually get it right. And it seems to me that that is not something that you would necessarily read about in hairdressing books, although perhaps it is, but it's something that comes with the what appear to be the central skills of hairstyling, in the same way as that ability that you get, I think, in skillful doctors to put people at their ease and to do all those things and to read the signals appropriately, is something that doesn't come from reading lots and lots of textbooks on microscopic pathology. It's that kind of thing that you have to sort of learn by doing. And I wondered what when you felt in your progression from being a novice to becoming an independent craftsman and then teaching people, where you felt that started to come into its own.
It took me 10 years time to be able to be. We never finish anyway, but a good 10 years to be able, as I say, to manipulate any time of hair texture and to.
But I was thinking about being able to read people at the same time.
Exactly,
yeah.
And the profile of the clients, because we're all similar. You travel the world and you find some people, they're identical as some other people you knew in the past or you know in the future. That's why everybody's got, I won't categorize, but not far. You got the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's why obviously sometimes you can transform the bad to the good and the ugly to the, you know what I mean.
Yes. So I think that's a very good point to pause now and just open things up for wider conversation. I'll enlist Emily again. Oh, you want one of these, won't you? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name's Agona. So I guess one thing that I'm really interested in is that you said that you might have a client for a long period of time. So say, for instance, 20 years. And I'm quite interested to, I mean, in my imagination, I thought, well, over those 20 years, a lot's going to change with a client's hair. So my interest is, what is your process of relearning? Because you might have a client for, say, 10 years and they're doing the same thing. And then they get to a stage in either their age or their hair texture changes. Yes. What's your process of getting to know that client again?
That's it. That's why now I need to train myself. And how do I do that? Is by teaching, as I say, by educating. Because by educating, you train yourself. Not on your own. You got to be with an environment. That's why I got a chance to work with some people around me. That's why within the environment, we exchange ideas. And we see what is working, and we constantly improving, obviously, our skills by exchanging. Even we got the craft, we know how to manipulate scissors with the latest technology, including products, and obviously analyzing the trends. We can always analyze and debate all together what is working or not, and what could work at the future. And with my clients, as you mentioned, I met them, they were students, and now they're nearly grandmother. Obviously, as you mentioned, the hair density isn't the same. The lifestyle has changed too. That's why you need to adapt yourself. And me and my other colleague are able to translate the demand and the trends to the person. That's why some of my clients who kept the same hairstyle all their life, obviously they're gone. But the one who are constantly in need and demand of, let's say, evolution, yeah, you need to provide this. And if you don't, you will lose them and they will go somewhere else. And I lost a few of them, and I will. And what is good is some of them, they went somewhere else, and few months or 3 years after, they get back to me. But some of them, they never came back. But why they come back to you? Because I asked them, what? Oh, because you understand this little bit here is always the other one, he cut it, but that was not as you. That's why, yeah, those details, which I understand because of my experience, because not only the technique, but the way I touch the hair, the way I manipulate my eyes and my tactile sense, I can go a bit more in depth.
So Fabrice, picking up on that point, can I ask you how you convey that to other people? Because it's one thing, having got to the point with many years of experience of being able to make these judgments and these observations and having the skill to do something, to do the right thing about them. But you said that you're constantly learning by teaching. So how are you helping other people to develop things when they have not yet gained the experience that have allowed you to make those judgments?
That's why we will teach the technique. We will teach what is the right way to create one length, a layering or a graduation. We will teach the people how to remove weight. We will teach the people how to keep weight. But after is by practicing. That's why you got the elements. I will say it's the same as painting. You got the technique, and after you find your way and you see what is working or not on your way. And after, depending who's buying your paint or not, if no one is buying your paint, it must be a reason, even you're satisfied. That's why you got to be careful. You got the commercial aspect. That's why you need to be aware of, you need to earn your life. That's why to be competitive and obviously competent. That's why, and after that came with time. This you cannot teach someone. That's the time skill, sadly. If not, lots of people, they think because of the technology, they can be straight away, bang on, yeah, but it's impossible.
Something about having to take its time and develop. Excellent. Okay.
I'm David Dobson. I'm a geologist, a university professor, and a wood engraver. But it strikes me that with what you're doing, there's a lot of performance aspects to it. And presumably with what you were doing, Roger, as a GP and as a surgeon, that a lot of the outcome is to do with how you interact with the patient or with the individual. And I wonder how much actually presenting of yourself is important, how much subordinating yourself and changing yourself to respond to the client is important in that performance.
I mean, certainly in my experience as a clinician and particularly a GP, I think performing was at the very heart of what I was able to do. And I think it ties in with what Joshua was saying earlier about trying to work out what is the nature of the problem that you are trying collaboratively with another person to resolve. And I guess that's what what Fabrice, I think, was saying about needing to work out what is the issue rather than just have the techniques. And I think the more I thought about it, the more I realized that all that medical information and those skills, and I mean, it all needed to be there, but it sort of receded into the background. And once I'd stopped thinking about how I could show it off in exams and things, it's sort of settled down. And the crucial thing then was developing a relationship, I think, with the person I was with, and trying to do these things like read them and understand what the problem was, and then think about ways of crystallizing the problem in a way that made sense to us both and allowed us to move forward in ways that were very different for each of us. And we had different needs. You know, I needed to make sure it was safe and wasn't missing things and was choosing the right treatment or whatever. And they needed to believe that it would work for them. But that was very much a question about performing. And the more I think about it, the more I think that we are, all of us, performing all the time to one another, although we switch roles continually between being performer and being audience, I think. And we're seeing that right now at the moment, and we've been seeing it in these conversations. And I think you see it in a consulting room, certainly from my experience as an insider there, but I think from my limited experience as an outsider in a hairstylist salon, and these other ones, you see it in all these areas of expert practice. That's how I see it. But Fabrice, does that make sense to you?
Totally. Totally, and I totally agree with you. That's why it's the same when the client coming to the shop, they're not talking a lot, they're a bit shy. You know, it's this atmosphere a bit. I mean, depending the shop you're going to, of course, the hairdresser is a bit like people, a bit clinical, I would say. And recently, when I work in the barber shop, obviously there was a bit more punchy, a bit more people shouting and dancing and singing and drinking. But again, that's different for every client. It's obviously different aspect of performance. Some people, they're going for the entertainment. Some people, they want to have a hairdresser which is obviously listening and static, and some other, they don't care. They go anywhere and they have their haircut, and sometimes with the music super loud, some DJs and some of course, which is nice, but depending who you are. That's why you need to have, you cannot serve all type of clientele, but you need to understand all of them.
It's about judgment and it's about reading situations. Okay, I think we've got time for one more point if anyone has one, and then it's going to be tea time.
I'm Barry Smith. I'm a professor of philosophy, but I also do sensory science. I wanted to point to something which I think is an interesting difference between your professions, because there are lots of parallels and they're interesting. But a key difference, I think, is that Roger being a medic, if we come under his hands, we don't feel able to judge competence in medicine. And therefore, we will tend to, we might not be happy with the results, but we'll tend to not want to question. And I think you, Fabrice, are much more in the position of a winemaker who is faced with a public who believe, despite your expertise, that they're just incredibly capable of judging the results and telling you whether it's good or bad. And I'm just wondering if you feel the frustration that winemakers do about that sometimes, where people are not quite appreciating how much goes into it and how carefully you've thought about it.
Honest with you, I don't have any pride. I love my job, and I understand people who are criticizing anywhere they go, the wine tasting, the restaurant, or even some people criticizing the diagnostic of the GP. Obviously, it'll be always those type of people who knows better than anyone else, especially those days with all those online tutorials. Some of my clients explaining to me because they have their hair wash, watching their YouTube, and explain to me how I'm gonna cut it. You're going to use this tool, aren't you? I say, no. Why? Panicking? Yeah, because your hair is not made for that. And obviously, people that trust more now their own knowledge within the technology, whatever it is, YouTube or the Instagram or whatever, instead than the professional. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very good point to leave it. Because it is time for us to go and make our own judgments about refreshments, which are coming up. And so we're going to break for 45 minutes or so. We're going to invite you to go next door and sample, have tea, which Elspeth is providing, cakes made by Prue and Dusha, and all sorts of other things. But finally, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Fabrice, and in 45 minutes. Well, welcome back, everybody, after tea, and again a big thank you to the makers of the tea, to Dusha and to Prue and others. So in this second half, we're going to pick up where we left off with the story of becoming expert. We were talking in the last couple of conversations, I suppose, about what it is to gain the skills and the embodied ways of knowing in the sort of early stages. But I mentioned in my introduction at the beginning that I think one of the crucial transitions a bit later on is this whole question of changing your point of attention or focus from yourself to your audience and whoever that might be. And my thinking about this has been really, really kicked off and profoundly shaped by conversations with a couple of magicians, and in particular, Will Houston. So, Will, I'll stop talking and hand over to you.
Certainly. So lovely to see everybody. My name's Will, as mentioned. I am a magician by profession. Somebody has to be. And me and a number of other people, including Richard McDougall, who's a wonderful magician who's coming this evening, have been chatting with Roger about this stuff for some time. I guess the only other thing to note by way of introduction is that my interest in magic is perhaps a little bit unconventional. I do quite like showing people card tricks on an occasion, But I also am the magician in residence at the Centre for Performance Science, which Roger co-runs. I did a PhD based on Victorian conjuring literature and its impact on young people's education. And I also do little bits of work here and there for film and theatre and television and that sort of stuff, helping actors do magic. So it's all magic stuff, but it's not necessarily just the doing tricks bit that perhaps first springs to mind.
But when you've got a magician joining you in a conversation, it would be inexcusable not to ask him to show a little glimpse of what magicians do. So we'll ask you.
In the interests of not being negligent, yes, let's. And also forgive me, people on Zoom. I am going to put the microphone down and everything would get in a right tangle. So let's go a little bit simpler. Down to 2, up from 2. Down to 1. And unfortunately, I can't make the last coin. Fortunately, however, I can do something reasonably similar. If I give it just a little squeeze for a moment, it very briefly becomes invisible.
So Will, thank you very much. So I think there are quite a lot of things there that we could talk about. But the one I'd like to start focusing on is what was going on, not just with your hands, but what was going on in the space between you and all these people here. Because when I first saw you perform, I suppose I was transfixed by the coins appearing and disappearing. But when we started to talk about it and I started to understand a bit about the other things that you were doing in terms of directing and shaping people's attention and their focus. It made me think a lot about things that came up just before the tea break about, you know, how whether you're a hairstylist or a tailor or a GP or a clinician, you are doing something like that. You're reading the people you're with and you're shaping and directing attention. And I know that magicians think very, very sort of analytically about that. Can you say a little bit about how that works in your world?
Yes, absolutely. It has to be said beforehand, though, I was slightly dreading when you said, seeing you do magic reminded me of something we were talking about before. I thought you were going to say boredom, and I'm very glad you didn't. With that out the way, I think one of the interesting things about magic is that a lot of people do think it's sleight of hand and fiddly-faffly stuff with cards and coins and that sort of thing. And certainly that's a tool, it's a skill that magicians need to be able to use. But on its own, that stuff isn't magic. I can sit in front of my mirror at home and fiddle around with a coin as much as I want, but it's not magic. I know exactly where the coin is at any given moment, and there isn't that little moment of wow. In order for it to become magic, there has to be somebody else who's engaging with it. They have to see the thing that the performer is doing, and they have to misinterpret that thing in just the right way so that they think something's happened that hasn't really, and that's the thing that gives you that little moment of the impossible, that little moment of wow. So sleight of hand, all of those things are certainly tools magicians use. Dexterity is important, but none of those things quite are magic. They only become magic when they're used with an audience in order to sort of co-create that little moment of wow with somebody else, which, as you said, ties in very, very neatly, I think, with some of the things that other people have spoken about. Because this whole thing is something which is co-created with an audience, magicians then spend quite a lot of time thinking about how they're engaging people, how they're interacting with people, and what things they can do to shape that experience. So perhaps just briefly to say, there are two possible versions of this, I suppose. One of them is controlling people's attention in order to make sure that they do know the story you're telling. The other aspect is controlling people's attention so that they don't see the sneaky stuff that you may or may not be doing. In terms of the storytelling, that coin trick, I think, is quite a good example. If I were just to reach out into the air and grab a coin without paying any attention to it, it's very unclear what that story is because there's no importance, there's no sort of surrounding stuff to it. If I give my attention to an invisible speck in the air, then I reach out and I grab it and I have a little look, suddenly you don't know what's there, but you do know there's something important there. You do know there's something I'm interested in, and your attention is being shifted in a way that will help tell that story as clearly as possible. So that's a good example of directing attention in terms of telling a story. The other thing that happens, though, is that if all you are looking up here and you're looking at this speck of nothing that I've pinched, that would be a very good opportunity for my other hand to be doing something sneaky because I know that all of your focus is up here. So that, I suppose, encapsulates the two different ways that one might think about attention during a magic trick.
And I thought that was very interesting because I was thinking that what appears to be a simple principle is actually very difficult, I know, to become expert at doing. But this idea that you can move people's attention from something that that you want them to focus on by asking them to, by looking at it, and then you can engage them in a different way. Say a little bit about that, because the business of, if you want them to look at it, I thought was a really interesting principle that I had not heard enunciated in the world of medicine at all. It was only when we started having conversations that I became aware of it. Say a bit about that.
Absolutely. So because this attention stuff's kind of important as far as magicians are concerned, we've spent a little while thinking about how you can shape it. And one of the best tools is something that a Scottish greengrocer, who was a fantastic coin magician, came up with. And it's a very, very simple rule, but it works incredibly well. And the rule is this: if you want somebody to look at something, you should look at that something. If you want somebody to look at you, you should look at them. So if you want somebody to look at something, you should look at it. If you want them to look at you, you should look at them. At the moment, I'm looking at you, a kind of collective you, and I can see lots of eyes coming up to my face, which is absolutely wonderful. I think if I do that, you'll probably all have bumped across to the cards. And then at the point where I look back up at you, you're going to come back to my face. It's just sort of the way people work. If you want them to look at something, look at it. That says it's interesting to me. That means it seems interesting to you. If I want you to look at my face, I can look at you and I know that you're going to look back at me because that's just the way the world is supposed to work. So magicians use this as a tool in lots of different settings, but it's something you can apply in other places as well. A simple example might be if you're giving a presentation of some sort, and quite often you see people talking about things they have on slides, or perhaps talking about a list of names on the wall behind them. And if you say, as you can see in this list of names, blah, 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 it's quite uncomfortable as an audience because I'm looking at you, you feel you should look at me, but I'm clearly telling you that something's going on here that you also sort of feel you should look at. And it's a little bit of a weird one where you go, oh, I don't really want to stop giving him eye contact, but I feel like I should look there. I don't know what to do. It feels awkward. Instead, if I say, as you can see on this list of names, blah, 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 it's very clear. All of your attention can go here. Then I can turn back to you, I give you my attention, you give me yours, and we can carry on talking in that face-to-face way. So this rule sort of fits in lots of contexts.
And it made a lot of sense to me when I was thinking about it, because although I was never trained to be a performing magician, absolutely not, in the clinical context, it occurred to me that there is a corollary to the, if you want them to look at it, which is that if you don't want them to look at it, don't look at it. And so as a GP, a patient comes into your consulting room, if you are sitting there writing up the notes from the previous patient or looking at your computer or whatever, almost certainly that person coming in will look at where you're looking. And even if they can't see it, if you're looking at a screen and the chairs are positioned so that they actually can't see the screen, they will still nonetheless want to be looking at what you're looking at, because that's where the center of attention will be. So if you want to make them feel, if you want them to feel that they have your undivided attention, you need to be aware of that and look at people when they come in. And this sounds blindingly obvious, but from having taught lots and lots of GPs about consulting and things and been to training sessions and things, it isn't obvious. It's a bit like that example I gave when I read a bit out of my book about, you know, laying things out in an orderly sequence. Seems so obvious that in retrospect, it seems amazing that it hadn't occurred to me, but it hadn't. And I think that this question of very apparently simple but powerful ways of sort of managing an interaction showed me that there are really powerful things to learn from completely outside medicine, in this case magic, that work equally well. And I guess that was one of the points I was making in the book, is that you can, if you pull together different insights from different people, none of whose work is an exact counterpart to your own, but all of which intersect to some extent, then you can find interesting things that you hadn't thought of. And I wondered, from your point of view, if you found interesting things you hadn't thought of that go in the other direction.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the thing that you say is very intriguing and something that probably lots of people in the room share, but it feels like you almost need a particular sort of person for this, which is maybe somebody who knows a lot about one thing, but is also particularly keen on trying to find points of connection with other stuff rather than points of difference. I know when I first met Roger, I was invited to come to a day with a group of magicians who were going to chat with a group of medical practitioners about the overlap between the two. I very much came for a giggle because I didn't have any idea what the possible overlap could be, but it turns out there's all sorts of interesting stuff. And I think that kind of openness is sort of an important thing. In terms of the way the two have intersected and the two have traveled around, I think the main things that I have taken away from it are the usefulness of some of these ways of thinking in other settings. I would have thought a lot about look at it, look at you stuff in the context of a magic trick. Probably not thought about it much before in the context of paying someone for something at a checkout in the past, but it works really well if you look at them when you say something and you look at your hand when you're getting the change and you're giving it to them. That interaction becomes easier. So sort of picking these things up and putting them in different contexts is something I've become much more aware of, I think. And the other huge thing about it is these points are very, very simple to explain, but only after you've explained them really quite badly quite a lot of times. And I think one of the things that this kind of interaction and interaction with lots of other people in this room has given is the chance to try discussing all of these ideas and work out what that simple and clear way of saying something is, so that you can then open up all the possibilities for conversation that emerge.
And I mean, there's something also interesting, which I noticed with Fabrice when he was showing how he uses scissors almost sort of without thinking about it when he was talking about something else. And when I see you do things, I mean, for example, I know you do lots of things that I don't see you do. But at least I assume so. But I know that
I actually can't do any of it. I've been pretending all this time. So, oh yes, I'm absolutely doing secret things all of the time we're talking, Roger. Very, very much so.
But I also know that you do things that it can see you do. And for example, the things that you do things with cards, don't you? That are sort of not exactly, well, are they magic or are they not? I mean, they are examples of dexterity and precision and great beauty, I think. But they are in a slightly different category, I suppose, in the sense that they are available to be seen.
Yes, absolutely. And as it happens, here I have a pack of cards. That was a lucky coincidence, wasn't it? Well spotted. So this is something which I think just gives a little insight into the dexterity side of things. We've talked briefly about attention and that experiential side. There is also the sleight of hand dexterity stuff going on as well. And normally, as Roger says, this is stuff you keep hidden, because the point is not to go, wow, they're dexterous. The point is to go, huh, that coin just melted out of existence. What happened there? So normally that dexterity is kept hidden. But there's a little sort of subgenre of magic where you do things which don't have any trick to them, but which do just demonstrate a little bit of dexterity. So maybe I can show you one of those. Again, forgive me, people on Zoom, I am going to go off mic, but you'll still get the idea, I think. So, a very quick little dexterity thing with first little step in this is to cut the cards into 2 equal piles. And when I say equal piles, I do mean equal piles. There are 52 cards in the pack, so you want 26 in each portion. Once you cut the cards equally, you can then shuffle them together. It looks reasonably like a normal shuffle, but again, it's just a teeny bit more precise. The cards have been interwoven so that they alternate 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, all of the way through the pack. So far, a little bit challenging to do, but not particularly interesting to watch. Hopefully, the interesting to watch bit comes in a moment. I push these almost all of the way together. Then effectively, I have a whole load of playing cards with a single playing card's thickness of gap in between them. If I grip the cards and then I slowly start to pull them apart, I can get to this position. And now here's the fun bit. If I hold the cards just hard enough that they're not falling out of my hands, but absolutely no harder, watch what happens. They sort of blossom outwards, and you end up with this rather pretty little display of a couple of little fans. So that's just a quick example of some sort of technical manipulation, no trick, but does give you an idea of what that sort of touch or feeling or something with an object might be in Magic's case.
Well, thank you. And I thought that was very interesting when I first saw that, because I mean, I had thought that that the world of surgery contained lots of dexterity, and it does contain lots of dexterity. But that is not the exclusive province of surgery by any means. And actually seeing this kind of thing really made me think that there are all these areas of extraordinary precision and dexterity, but you often don't see them. And that sort of contrast between the stuff that magicians do that you never see, because that's what being expert involves, and this subgenre, as you call it, of the flourishes, really to me was a fascinating example of that level of control and precision and sort of mastery of your materials. But I guess one of the things that must happen from time to time in your world, as it does in everybody's, I suppose, is that things don't go quite according to plan. And I don't know if sometimes it doesn't work out quite as you hoped, or people don't receive it quite as you hoped they would. And so I thought we could just spend a couple of minutes talking about dealing with the unexpected and maybe improvising and what that might mean for a magician, what it might mean for a clinician, what it might mean for other people in the room. In other words, dealing with that whole area of uncertainty and the things that you can't completely predict.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really interesting one from a magical point of view. There are a few different points, I suppose, where uncertainty or improvisation might come into play. One of the examples is when things have gone horrifically wrong, which they have in many embarrassing ways over the course of my career as a magician. It's been quite a lot of fun in many ways. And sometimes those are things that you can improvise your way out of in a way which is unbeknown to an audience. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes they're things where you just have to sort of admit and agree with everyone that something unexpected has happened and it didn't quite work as you'd hoped it might, and then try and move on to something else. And both of those, I suppose, would be improvising as a result of something unexpected which has come up in the course of a performance. The other time when you might try and improvise is when you don't know quite where something's going to go, but you do feel that there might be some opportunities for something good to happen. A good example of that might be that if you were doing a card trick, let's say, where you were going to ask somebody to shuffle a pack of cards, you would give them a pack of cards to shuffle, and then when they give it back to you, you might just have a quick sneaky peek to see whether you had 2 or 3 aces either near the top or near the bottom of the deck. If you happen to notice them there, you can improvise and go off the course of the trick you'd expected, because 3 aces near the top of the deck is a very nice starting point to make 4 aces appear from a shuffled pack. If they're not there, as the chances are they probably won't be, then you can just continue into the trick that you were originally intending to do. So I suppose that might be the other improvisational approach of saying, I'm going to maximize the opportunity for beneficial improvisation rather than I'm going to use improvisation to try and get out of something that's not gone.
So you've got a plan in mind, but you're keeping an open mind about opportunities that arise
Yeah,
along the way.
absolutely. You're looking for the deluxe version, I suppose, and it may or may not happen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of in a clinical consultation, from my experience, you often get that because you have a sense in your mind of where you think it will go or where you want it to go, but actually it's always slightly different. And you, I think, need to be able to recognize opportunities and run with them when you see them. And to begin with, in my experience, again, that wasn't easy because I was trying as hard as I could to remember all the facts and the stages and things. But as I became more experienced, I think I was able to kind of loosen up a bit and go where it took me, but knowing that I could bring it back again if it went a little bit further than I expected. And I think that maybe is something that comes with moving into that sort of middling phase of becoming confident with what is at the edges of what you've learnt, but sort of being more confident to step out away from the center line. Do you think that makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's about knowing that you can bring things to some sort of a successful conclusion. And that means you have room to deviate from the thing that you've planned and you've got sort of on your mind. And the interesting thing that it brought to mind is I've been doing a little bit of work in theatre lately. And because nobody has done any theatre making really for a year and a half, at least in a sort of big theatre in-person way, it's been fascinating watching people work together because everyone is back after a big gap. Everyone is still good enough to make things when everything is working well. But the thing that has been lost a bit is the ability to get things back on track after they slip away from the plan. And so it feels like people's capacity pre-pandemic, not having the chance to do this all the time, was that you could make things work when they went the way you wanted them to, and you had plenty of room left over to be able to fix things if they started to go off track. Whereas now, because people haven't done it for a while, because everyone's settling back in again, everyone has the capacity to make it work. But as soon as that plan starts to go away, it suddenly starts to get a little bit more edgy, a little bit more risky, maybe.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I think this is a good point to pause and open things up to questions from all of you. So, Emily, once again.
So has that happened in medicine? That nowadays we have a bunch of doctors where when things go wrong, they don't have a clue what they're doing.
I hope that's putting it a bit strongly. No, but I think it is true. I think you do have to keep in practice. I mean, I certainly was aware as a GP, and I think as a surgeon too, that when I've been away for on holiday for 2 weeks, for example, even just a short time, it took a while before I got back to that breadth of how far away from the center line I was comfortable with, and that confidence was the first thing that started to get blunted, I think, when I was away from it. And it particularly happened when I was at one stage when I was a GP. I was ill for about a year. I was away from practice, and by the time I got back, it wasn't so much remembering the facts and things. It was what you've just been talking about that I needed to get back. That was the bit that I noticed. It's rather like, you know, the year and a half away because of COVID. If you have a year and a half away for some other reason, I think, certainly in my experience, it took quite a while to become comfortable at the margins of what I thought I was able to do. I'm not sure if it's losing it completely. I think maybe it's I think some of these things need to be what's the word? They need to be continually watered in order to continue growing. And if you don't do that, then they can die back a little bit. They haven't gone for good, but they need to be continually sort of, it's like needing to sort of continue giving a little turn to a wheel in order for it to continue to rotate. And if you don't do that for a while, it slows down and stops, and then you have to start it up again, and it uses more energy to do that. I think that's how I saw it.
You're doing things continuously, you're sort of always warmed up, I suppose, to an extent. And then when you leave it for a week, you're no longer warmed up, and it takes a bit longer to kind of get back to peak performance, I think.
Hi, Professor Rankin in the Faculty of Medicine. So I think the greatest display of clinicians and scientists pivoting and improvising has been COVID, because clearly, you know, clinicians, respiratory scientists, they didn't know how to treat COVID. And so they had to experiment to some extent, and they were using, you know, what they knew about other respiratory pathogens. But for example, we saw people, you know, on their backs, and then suddenly it was like, no, they should be put on their fronts. That's more effective. So things were changing, but more so really interesting, you know, being somewhere like Imperial, across the whole university in all the faculties, suddenly, you know, the chemical engineers within a month had got sort of donations of alcohol from Sipsmith and were making hand sanitizer. You had the sort of electricians of, you know, creating new sort of PCR kits that could be used in refugee camps and things like that. You had the mechanical engineers trying to make pumps and things, sort of respiratory pumps that could be again taken out to developing countries where they didn't have big hospitals. So you saw this incredible, you know, spirit of innovation and coming together. And I just think, yeah, that was sort of interesting. And it's just interesting hearing this about mastery and being an expert. And it's very interesting as a scientist what that means, because as a scientist, you work at the bench. That's your sort of apprenticeship, is at the bench, and your journeyman. But when you become the expert, you're no longer at the bench. So you're no longer actually doing the things that you mastered, but it's the level of thinking then. And that's where the sort of mastery comes. So it's a very odd thing, because you've trained to do one thing, but during that training, you're also learning how to, you know, think scientifically and have that scientific perspective, to the point where you no longer are doing the thing, but you can orchestrate it.
If I can, I think that's really, really interesting and very true, and also makes me feel like an idiot for spending lockdown thinking about card tricks rather than something more useful in the world. But I think it does tie in with another aspect of improvisation, which is, as a magician, something you might improvise as a joke or a humorous remark that you think might fit on a particular occasion. And after you do that, one of the things that you try and make sure you do is say, was that good? If yes, was it better than what I would normally do? And if it was better than what I would normally do, that should now be the thing that I normally do. And one of the things that I think will be fascinating over the course of the next years and decades, I suppose, is whether all of those sort of societal improvisations with people working on problems they hadn't worked on before, or considering that delivery people are actually ridiculously important in society in a way that maybe bankers aren't, are improvisations that people say, actually, that's better than what we had before. Let's keep on in that direction, having used the improvisation as a provocation for change, or whether improvisation is just seen as a way to fix a short-term problem that then allows you go back to the normal. And I obviously don't know what the answer will be, but I'm sort of intrigued to find out.
Yeah, and I guess what you were saying, Sarah, I mean, it goes back to this idea that I think that we've been exploring today so far of bringing together people from completely different areas of expert practice, where what they have in common is that they are expert, although the area that they are expert in may seem to be completely different. And so when you've got the mechanical engineers and the electrical engineers and the fluid mechanics people, all those people, they are kind of bringing different perspectives on a problem. And it seems to me that one of the things we can look at here, maybe not exactly a problem, but an idea of what it is to become expert at whatever you're becoming expert in, that there are things we can learn from other people that shine a brighter light on some parts of our practice that we ourselves may have overlooked. This is getting a bit heavy, isn't it? I think it's probably about time to move on. But I want to just leave the last word really with Will, in terms of where all this might go, I suppose, in terms of looking at these processes that we need to go through in ourselves. And to me, this business of how you calibrate what is the purpose of your work, and that moving from a a sort of focus on yourself and all the difficult processes that you're going through that we've talked about of gaining skills and becoming fluent and things, how you then move on to that next stage of making sure that it works for other people in some way, whether they're seeing you do it with a magic show, or whether they're seeing your work afterwards in a gallery, or whatever it might happen to be, because it seems to me that that is an important part on this path.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a jump that some magicians, but perhaps not all, quite manage to make. I think there's sort of a general route into magic, which is sort of founded on some fairly deep-seated social insecurity that then makes you go, I tell you what, if I could do impossible things, then I'd be interesting. And it's easy to go, I can do impossible things, I'm interesting, and never get beyond that, which turns you into an intolerable bore, frankly. But good magicians, I think, get beyond that and start to go, this is about creating these moments for other people, which you can give them a little gift of that moment of wow, or the moment of the rules didn't seem to quite apply in some way. And I think the interesting thing is that a lot of the time magicians design magic tricks based on technical stuff that they know they can do. But a lot of the time, those tricks aren't great. The tricks which tend to be much better are the ones where you say, what experience am I trying to create for my audience instead? And just as a very brief practical example of that, one of the tools which I've started using recently, a friend told me about, is the idea of think, feel, and do. So you say, what do I want people to think, feel, and do when they see my show? But not just what do I want them to think, feel, and do when they see my show, what do I want them to think, feel, and do when I start doing this trick? What do I want them to think, feel, and do in the middle? What do I want them to think, feel, and do at the end? And by looking at things that way, you can start to define clearly the experience you're trying to create for somebody. And once you've defined that experience clearly for somebody else, it's then much, much easier to make it than it is if you're just having a punt, I suppose.
Which I think brings us back to where we started a couple of hours ago in talking to Joshua about his starting point being what it is that somebody wants a suit or jacket to do. And I think for what Fabrice was saying about what it is that a hairstyle, that person wants it to achieve. In your case, what it is that a magic trick sets or a magician sets out to do. And in the case of clinicians, what is the purpose? You know, what is the problem that somebody is coming with? Not leaping immediately to specific solutions, but trying to work that out first. So I think we're going to, we are going to move on to the final section almost. But first of all, can I just give a big thank you to Will for taking part. And now it's a great pleasure to hand the baton over to two people who have very different perspectives. Ms. Sam Gallivan is a consultant orthopedic surgeon, hand surgeon, and Brother Nina Bilby is the head of historic stone carving at the City and Guilds of London Art School. Two people with different perspectives and a fascinating conversation to come. So there's a spot there if you want it. And I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Performance anxiety now.
Yes, I know. We have to follow a real performer.
I haven't had a haircut for ages.
I'm worried about my hair.
I know.
I may not be dexterous
What
enough.
I'm wearing is not
This is very concerning. I know. Well, thank you, Roger. This part you will see is a little bit different. Roger's sort of MO is the conversation. So you may have already experienced it. We had a 45-minute break. And in the 45-minute break, pretty much what happened was cake eating and conversation. So this last part, I hope, will be a conversation with his book. And through talking to Nina and telling you about a workshop that we held together, see where some of the primary research that is built on Roger's work, see the direction that's going, and look at the horizon, what could come next. So my name's Sam Gallivan. I'm a hand surgeon. I trained at Imperial College. I still work at Imperial College 25 years later. But I'm now an educator, and I'd say we talk a lot about professional identity in surgical education, and my identity has changed from just being a surgeon to becoming a surgeon educator, and increasingly thinking more about education theory. Nina, What would you call yourself?
I love the fact you just said, I was just a surgeon and then I became my name's Nina. I've been a stone carver for over 35 years. I was a high school teacher for some of that and a potter before that. And I've been teaching stone carving for quite some time. I'm a freelance sculptor, and our commonalities, I think, is that our materials and the fact that we teach now at quite a high level. And here we are.
So could you tell us a bit about the course you teach on? Because that's pretty special.
So we're the only BA and MA in Northern Europe to teach stone carving and wood carving. And we're the only school to kind of recognize that people are demanding those kind of courses at that level of education. There was a diploma course for many, many years. We've been there since 1800 and something. And that's
at City and Guilds Art School.
Yeah, in Kennington. And we found that people come to carving very late in life. They don't tend to start at 16 anymore. They tend to come in their mid-20s when they discover us, because it's quite a difficult career to discover unless you grow up with it. And so we take helicopter pilots, ballerinas, garden designers, bricklayers, people who left school at 16, people who've done 3 or 4 degrees and MAs across the board, and we start them at 0, and through a kind of journey of learning and repetition and boredom, we churn out reasonable people who will go on to make or restore this nation and Europe's historic buildings.
So we were very lucky for the workshop that we're going to tell you about. We were allowed, thanks to Nina, to use their carving studio, which is it's one of the most beautiful spaces. I'm sure that lots of people here will be much more familiar than me with an art studio, but it's got this light. It's got art covering every wall, floor space, available table space, and the sound is incredible. The sound of people carving all the time around. I think we hit you at around sort of exam time, so there's a real excitement in the whole of the school.
Smell of despair.
Oh, the smell of grease paint. I mean, it was really similar to a clinical exam being run. It's got that same sort of bunny and headlamps sort of, that this are really big important things coming. Don't break it. Don't hurt anyone. Yeah, it is. So the reason why we had a workshop was very selfishly for my MEd dissertation project. So I had to do a piece of primary research, and I had met Roger and Dusha and had a conversation with them in 2017, absolutely by chance. So I was in New York on fellowship at Columbia at the narrative medicine program. And in that way, like really nice way that when you're a Brit abroad, people go, oh, there's another Brit in town. I'm like, okay, New York's a big town. And I came to a talk, and Roger was talking about a lot of the themes that are in the book, and I thought it was fascinating. Long story short, I ended up doing his master's program. And we came to have a conversation about the similarities between being an orthopedic surgeon who uses hammers and chisels and sharp tools on hard materials, and what it feels like to be a carver. So on the day, we got 4 artists who use, who are either makers or carvers, who have a very sort of practical practice in making things, mostly carvers, and 4 surgeons, and got them in a room to talk about what their sensory experiences are. And the reason for that being was, in surgery is really examined. So people spend years of their life watching what surgeons do in the operating theatre, but they tend to ask them the same words, why and how they do what they do. And we don't really attend to the sensory experiences. So how surgeons use their sense of touch, how they use sound and smell to make decisions and monitor their progress. And one of the things we realized really early on is that carvers do the same thing. So I'm going to, the other thing to think about is I do qualitative research. So when I read the audio transcripts, you have never been listened to as much as when I listen to people's words and analyze them. So
you said this is like 3 years ago.
It's just, I don't know. I must
say a lot of stuff, love. No one ever listens.
Hours of my life just thinking about it. And you said 2 things that sort of trot around my head. Do you mind? I'm gonna give you a little poke. Do you mind telling these stories, because I think they're fascinating?
So you asked me to expose my vulnerabilities earlier.
I very much did.
And then she said, you don't have to, in that kind of closed question way, meaning yes, you do.
You can pick one. What about What about the sound?
So we were talking about, I'm in charge of, say, 30 people in 3 different rooms, and I can be in a very in-depth conversation about, carving realistic drapery in marble as opposed to carving it in limestone and why it's appropriate in this setting and that setting. And then I'll stop and I'll be like, wait a minute. And I'll walk 3 rooms over and I'll be like, what are you doing to a student? And because I can hear them making mistakes, and I can hear the stone screaming out for me to stop them abusing it. And stone has a soul, and sometimes these souls scream at me from other rooms. And so, you have to, I was taught that stone carvers have a beat, stone carving is rhythm and dance, and there is a beat to it. And we had a conversation about using the tools badly destabilizes a matrix, that the stone, the materials that they can break and they can fight you all the way. They have to be wooed and dated and kind of taken out for dinner. They cannot be smashed into submission. And that's what we were talking about. I can hear mistakes going on from quite a long way away. And I can tell you what tool they're using. I can tell you what they're not doing. And I can tell you if they're sitting down, which is quite an interesting thing to be able to, a bit like a magician. I can say, I think James is sitting down. I need to go and deal with this. It's just like, you do not carve sitting, like hairdressing, you don't do it with your bum on a seat. What are you doing? It's ridiculous.
Well, we do, but that attention, that there are so many things that that others in the room on that day picked up on that. So the fact that it was also carving that's going well sounds beautiful. You said it was sublime on the day. Would you stand by that?
Absolutely, it's music. It's absolutely, and you can forget it. You're hearing this noise, but actually it becomes white noise. And then when it's going badly, there's this nasty, it's like scraping a chair along the floor. You can immediately tell that someone's either not enjoying themselves because it slows right down, or that they're speeding up too fast because they're terrified and they just want to leave. So you can hear people's personalities through the way they're using the tools, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, we have a similar thing in orthopedics where you can imagine that people's bone density is very different at different stages of life, of how the bone is shaped. Some people's bones are shaped differently from other people's. In fact, everyone's are. But if you're trying to seat an implant, you have to have the implant, prepare the bone ready for, let's say, a hip replacements go in, and then strike the part that's going to go down into the thigh bone with a hammer, like so. And the hammer blow, you feel it through your hands. You can watch the broach go down and then swapped for the real implant. But what you're really doing is listening. And this is really recognized amongst surgeons, that you listen for this tone change. So while it's safe and the bone is breathing and doing that sort of, scientifically, it's hysteresis, whatever you want to call it, sort of an elastic deformation, and it springs back. It goes donk, 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 donk. And just as the bone's about to go, it goes ding, 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 ding. And that tone change is really, if you're training someone, it's the thing that makes you go, who did that? And that all of these things, they're handed down very much as stories in surgery. They're the sort of thing that someone leans over the table and tells you. Maybe you get them in textbooks, but it would be, can you imagine trying to explain that? So these are the parts of practice, parts of expert practice, that are incredibly difficult to articulate in words. So one of the challenges as a researcher is trying to tease out ways in which we can capture and communicate these thoroughly embodied bits of expert practice, these facets, the things that make you a real expert. You'd agree. How are we doing? I'm also, now that's had to turn your attention. The thing that's got the clock on it is my watch. So I keep looking at my watch and I'm really bored. Sorry. What do you think about, there was one other thing which I thought was very interesting, and especially from someone who's an expert, about the feeling when you've got one shot to get something right.
So this is my vulnerability coming out here, like my worst nightmare. We were talking about, horrendous haircuts and how you get over that. I was asked a few years ago to carve a couple of the royal family, and I got to the end of a particular life-size statue of a member of the royal family, and then it had to go in a particular place, and casually looked through some photographs on my iPad, and I did a kind of judgment call of the height of that member of the royal family and the building it was going in. And I looked at the stone courses, you know, the courses in the building, and I thought, that's not going in there. That's not going in there. That really isn't going in there. And I kind of lost all the blood from my head down. And it had already gone. It had gone to the building, but it was in situ, ready to go in. So I got in my car and I drove in the middle of the night, and I might have broken into a landmark building of this country. I might have gone up on the scaffolding with a head torch. Just minorly, I might have been warned by a security guard with a tailor's tape, because all my tools are in storage for the installation the following day. And I might have gone up in the dark trying to find the top of the alcove it was sitting in, dropped the tape to the floor and stood on the tape. And then I might have gone down to the floor and just gone, oh. And I knew at that point it would go in, but I knew my career would come to an end if it wouldn't, or I'd have to get very good at kind of chopping hairstyles down. I'd have to have given them a bit of a buzz cut, maybe taken some status lift off their shoes. But yeah, it was improvisation. We've covered that.
Yeah, it is
It's
improvisation.
Improvisation, and to knowing that you can, I didn't know, but I hoped that I could get myself out of it if it was the case. But
because I mean, that's
one of the most
something-
terrifying moments of my life. Yeah.
I was just thinking, that's something that we would you say what we've talked about whether it's high stakes and what high stakes mean in my profession and yours. And when you tell that story, I feel my fingers, curl like that. I can imagine what it means to have something so important.
Career, just like if you'd hurt somebody, it probably would have ended yours. Yeah.
Just like that. And it's one of the things I think we share, there's an obvious resonance in what we do with our hands. So we hit things with hammers and we hit them on hard things. So that there's obviously that. But there is something about, there's one shot. Sometimes it comes down to, you just have to hit it a bit harder and trust yourself that you get yourself out of that.
I think we talked earlier about when you're at the beginning of your career, and I've just had a load of undergraduates start, all these wonderful, doe-eyed, brave people who've put their lives on hold to come and do a 3-year degree. And, I'm in awe of that. I didn't do that. I kind of did mine through traditional apprenticeships and things, and begging people to teach me and things like that. I'll do it for free. Let me work. But these people put themselves in debt and they're all there, and what I then asked them to do is to break things. I need them to push the material so far that the material will break, so they know then how far to pull themselves back. And they look at me like I'm nuts. I don't want to learn to break things. I want to learn to make beautiful things. But unless you make mistakes while you've got somebody kind of rubbing you on the back and telling you everything's going to be all right, when you get to, say, my level, then I know what a mistake feels like, and I know what it feels like to go towards a mistake and how to get myself out of it. And I think then it's being brave enough to take chances and go towards risk with management of risk. So to still feel like you are free enough and creative enough and interested enough to make those risks, but at the same time knowing that you can kind of get yourself out of pretty much anything with a tailor's tape.
And risk is one of the things we struggle with, and the management of risk during training is one of the things we really struggle with in medical education, and surgical education in particular. You can't have people operating untrained. You have to find where your boundaries are in a completely safe environment, because it is inappropriate for the public to be put in harm's way. And finding where that point is, that moment where you're handing over the things that you entrust to a junior member of staff. It's a huge theme at the moment in medical education, the idea that there are professional activities that are in themselves entrustable. And there comes a threshold point where you've spent time with a junior member of your team and you say, actually, you can do this now. But it's not just a skill, it's sort of a total part of your practice you feel ready to hand over to someone. And where we find that, it's one of the ideas about how the arts can be used in health professions education, is that if you can explore important boundaries and risk in your practice, maybe you can simulate some of what that feeling is to approach disaster and come away from it.
And be honest about your disasters. I mean, like, I know many people who trained me, well, nearly all the people who trained me had such a sense of humility, and they would tell me about disasters. You know, oh, don't worry, you know, I'd break something, I'd be heartbroken. They'd be like, oh my God, that's nothing, you should have seen, da, 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 da. And they would tell me, and I'd feel so much better and respect them more, actually. But then you also come across people who are kind of quite closed and feel it a weakness to expose their mistakes. But actually, as a teacher, as a mentor, the only thing I really do have to offer is my mistakes, because that's how I've learned, and I will continue to make mistakes and learn. And, you know, allowing them access into my own making life is the only way for me to learn. We've explored this earlier with other conversations, you know, the whole idea that how do you stay interested in something you've been hitting, you know, shooting a basketball for 30 years. I've been hitting a chisel for 30 years. I mean, how dull is that? You know, you'd think, God, you know, but teaching other people, and I think people ask me, you know, you're going to teach forever, and I love it. I see it as something that goes hand in hand with my own professional practice. So when it's an obligation to teach, I have an obligation to pass on those skills.
So you have an obligation within yourself to
the profession, to those people, to the people who taught me. I'm a carbon copy of the people who taught me, and as a respect to them, I must pass those journeys and those mistakes and those lessons on. And if I don't do that, I'm doing everybody who had the goodwill and the generosity of skills they gave to me. If I don't pass those skills on, that's very disrespectful for them. And, you know, without them, I wouldn't be making a living. So I wouldn't be doing something I love.
And in what ways could the structures around your work support that better? Is it easy to become a teacher in what you do?
Well, there aren't many of us doing it. There aren't many women doing it. And I think you have to, it's management of ego. Some people can't. We've talked about management of ego. We also had a conversation earlier about that we're very proud of what we do, but we're really quick to ditch pride if we know somebody can do it easier. We will just go and like, how did you do that? I want to know. You know, I will ditch my pride and go and ask somebody for, yeah, I need to know the secret of that. You need to tell me that. So you need to be inquisitive. I think without inquisitive nature, makers become stagnant. You need to take that inquisitive nature all the way through your working life. So how do you make better teachers? How could you turn it into that? Just love what you do. Just love what you do and just keep passing it. You know, you just get into it, don't you? You can feel the joy, pass on the joy.
Yeah. And that's what we have in common. I think that is, it's like a really dogged enjoyment of just physically what we do. And that was something from sort of nodding back to the research. It was something that came out that was really unexpected, was joy in the sensory experience and in the doing of it. So good carving sounded beautiful. It was enjoyable to do. Like actually flow, or kind of, or let's park the concept of flow. But the idea that you get into your practice and you're completely dissociated from it, those seem to be quite fleeting moments. And actually people, what will you feel? You know,
if you have 5 minutes of elation a day, that is such a good day. I don't know about anyone else, but if I think, oh, hello, I can do this. I'm not bad at this. You turn your head and you look back and you're like, you're an idiot. What on earth are you thinking? This isn't, you know, God. So you've got to live for those moments, I think. And everything else is an uphill struggle, but yeah, what a struggle.
Yeah. What do you think about the boredom?
I think boredom, I can't remember who said Picasso said boredom is the seat of all creation, isn't it? I think it's, when I started making things at 13, I went into an unofficial apprenticeship in my spare time with a potter, and he did a lot of slip casting. And if anybody, obviously there's some potters in the room, slip casting, there's this thing called sponge and fettling, which is scraping off the seams and wiping the seams back. And if you're 13, there is nothing less sexy than having to scrape off the seams of like slip cast cats. And, you know, he'd come in with boards of hundreds of these cats, and he'd be like, for £2 an hour, whatever I was getting, you know. And I remember what kept me going was the guy working next to me who was terrible at it. And I'm like, I am so much better than you. Look at me. I can do 10 an hour and you can only do 3. But also because I adored the guy who taught me. and to actually make him realize that I was worth investing his knowledge in kept me going. I was inquisitive. I wanted to do better. And that focus, you do step away. There's this kind of meditative state of just doing the same things with your hands and eyes and body. And it's dancing. Everything is rhythmic. You know, you're kind of moving around. And at the end of the day, somebody else earlier said about, you know, if you forget what you're doing and you're listening to music or whatever, you can kind of make mistakes. And I totally agree with that. You know, I can listen to like certain musics, but I can't listen to others. If I tried to listen to an audio book the other day, and it was absolutely impossible. First of all, I found I was standing there like this. It was a Yo Nesbo book. I was so depressed. I was like, this isn't happening again. But if I have other kind of background noise, I can do it. But generally, I have to be absolutely focused on the noise the material's making. Boredom's great. I think boredom is the seat of everything. But try telling an undergraduate that it's just giving you $9,000. They're like, really?
It doesn't go down well with undergraduate
well.
medical students either.
How are you going to assess that?
Yeah.
What's that? Try writing that learning outcome. You are going to learn to be bored and deal with it.
Well, as someone who works in curriculum design, that's particularly painful to hear. Yes, yeah, we have that problem. I think that's the other thing that I have found extraordinary and genuinely useful through our conversations is realizing that we have more in common as teachers, as people who are hopefully good at what we do. I know you're good at what you do, but and people who teach for a living are very special and not always respected in the wider profession. I think across.
I think there's a compromise. You can be a really good maker or a medical, like something so much today has resonated with me. The fact that you move away from your love as you go through your career. Now I compromise my working week. Ideally, in an ideal world, perhaps I would be in the studio 5 days a week, 12 hours a day, making things. But actually the compromise is I adore teaching. So 2 days of my working week, I'm in the workshop. But now, of course, I've got to a senior level and I'm managing people making. So they're having I get really jealous about these interesting conversations they're having, and I find myself kind of putting myself in between them and the student going, no, well, what can't they do? Well, maybe they should use a different chisel, to say, I still want to be on the interesting side of the problem solving, because that's what teaching is.
Yeah. So that feels like a time other people must be ready. I can feel the room kind of peering over and going, we've got something to add as well. Does anyone have anything? I see. Oh, good. May I?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, really, what an honor it's been to be here today and to share so many of these stories and experiences. In fact, it's made me just write down a few words, if I may read them out. It's replenishment, sense, smell, sound, feel, improvising, time, imperfection, perfection, thinking, dog food, milk. That's wrong. Boring. I think it's wonderful to be able, everyone in this room who works in all of our different disciplines, to be able to share in some extent some of those words. And for me, it's just fantastic to be coming out of 40 years of self-isolating to come to London and get away from my studio and meet all these fantastic people. So for me, it's a thank you, but also a thank you for being impressed and honored. And yeah, that's it really. Thank you.
We're getting towards the end of this session, and in a moment I'm going to ask Prue just to say a couple of words before I say a few final things. Could I draw to your attention again? Well, actually, sorry, before you get up, you have got up. I just wanted to say a big thank you to Nina and to Sam. I didn't mean to inflict such an abrupt disruption on your conversation, but I thought that was a perfect way of bringing together a whole lot of the strands that we've been talking about over the afternoon. I hope that you have been having ideas and thoughts. And please, could I remind you again that here are some blank pieces of card. There seem to be pretty much exactly the same number of these as there were at the beginning. But if you would like to write down some comments, Andrew, such as yours, or drawings or diagrams or full color representations in 3 dimensions of ideas that you've been coming across, then please do. Or also, if you feel moved to wish to buy a copy of this book, we have got copies over here. I forgot to mention that. Please do speak to Dusha if you haven't got a book and would like one. But just before the final sort of element of the afternoon, I'm going to hand over to Prue just to say a couple of words.
Okay. After this part of this next part of the afternoon, which I think is you saying something, yeah, there'll be about 15 minutes for rounding off the discussion, and then we'll need some time before the next event. Those few of you who are returning for this evening's event, I'm afraid we'll need an hour to rearrange the room. So there's fresh air outside and a good pub, but remember to come back. And for those of you who will be leaving, thank you so much for coming and contributing to the discussions. William Morris was listening intently to it all. And as Roger has just said, don't forget, if ideas have emerged which you think could usefully be pursued here, let us know.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. So we're pretty much at the end. I just wanted to say a few words about, we've talked a lot about where things have come from. I wanted to say a few words about where I hope things will be going. It seemed to me more and more from listening to what everybody's been saying that we've talked about becoming expert, but I think the way that being expert is expressed, we can think of as being through performing. And that idea of performing is something that I'm becoming more and more interested in, because I think that it's something that it often hides in plain sight. And when we're hearing from Joshua about what it is to be a bespoke tailor, from Fabrice about being a hairstylist, from Will about being a magician, my own experience for being a clinician, and just recently from Nina and Sam, and all the comments in the room, I think running through those is a strand of performing. I think we often think about performing in the context of people who you would think of as performers. It might be people like Will doing magic shows, it might be musicians, it might be dancers, but actually all of us are performing in one way or another all the time, because that is how we do the work that we do. That is how we engage with other people. That's how we engage with objects and materials. And in fact, all these stages that I've talked about in this book, going from apprentice to journeyman and to mastery, all these are underpinned by the human experience of performing, which at its simplest, I suppose, is say 2 people, one of whom is a performer, one of whom is an audience to that performing. And I think these roles keep changing. I think in a conversation that we have over the kitchen table, we move from performing to being audience and back again all the time. I think all around us there are people who are performing, but we often don't think of it in those terms, and so we don't recognize it. And of course, the very the sort of obvious ones, what you see on concert platforms and sports fields and so on. But I think that I think to me, this afternoon has sort of exemplified what happens when you bring people together from very different backgrounds, with very different kinds of experience, to share and to look for points of connection. And I think that the conversations we've had during these sort of formal parts of the afternoon, but perhaps even more so the conversations that happened out there over tea and cake, have brought into view points of connection that I think will grow and develop. And I think that if we think about what we do in terms of performing, there is also a place for people with different perspectives to come together and try and make sense of what that word means, because I think often to people it has a sort of implication of being in some way inauthentic, putting on an act, doing something that isn't really you. I don't think about performing like that at all. I think performing is a way of presenting those aspects of the real you that are most appropriate for that moment and for whoever else is in that interaction. And I think that that is a skill that we have, all of us, developed to a very high degree, although we're not always aware of it. But some people have developed it in an even higher degree. And I think if we can start to think about what is the nature of the performing that we do, because that is how we are doing the things that we are interested in, we can start to build a composite picture of what that means that I hope will make sense to a lot of people in the way that I think, certainly from the conversations I've had before, do seem to make sense in terms of how people become expert. But how people become performers and what that means is something that I think would be a very interesting area to explore in more detail. And I hope that as time goes on, you will agree to join me in having more conversations about what that idea might mean from your various different kinds of expert practice, and how we can, again, build a composite picture of what that means and where it might go. And I think it's pretty much time for me to stop talking now, because everybody needs a break. And so it just remains for me to say a big thank you once again to all of you for coming here, of course, to the Art Workers Guild, to the Outreach Committee, and to all the many people who are not only in this room, who are joining us, of course, on Zoom, but other people who have been involved in this whole enterprise for a very long time. A big thank you on behalf of all of us to everybody who's taken part, and for making this such an enjoyable and fascinating afternoon. So thank you.